Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this think tank lunch. My name is Lauren Keel. I'm the general manager for Bloomberg Green, which is the climate sustainability section of Bloomberg News. Excited to be with all of you. Thanks again for joining us. I'd like to give a big thank you to Ericsson for sponsoring our lunch today and helping to make this conversation possible. Look forward to hearing from Catherine in just a little bit. We're going to be talking a bunch today about connectivity, both how it can improve business outcomes, but also how it can make companies more sustainable. So excited to share that with you with some great speakers. Before I introduce our first speaker and bring him up here, I want to remind you to eat. This is a lunch, so please eat. We know it's going to be a little noisy. There's going to be cutlery. It's totally fine. We're used to it. We're going to project. You'll hear us fine. So please, the food's going to be coming in, and the courses are going to be coming through as we go through this. So make yourselves at home. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Sandeep, you want to come join me up on the stage here? We're going to jump up into these chairs. You guys get to enjoy how short I am trying to get into the tall chair, and now I'm stuck. Okay. Now I'm swirling the other way. This is hilarious. Okay.
I've got these adjusted.
We should have gotten these adjusted sooner. I know, exactly. Sandeep, thank you so much for joining me. You're joining us from Virgin Media. I'm sure many people are very, very familiar with you guys in the room today. We want to talk about the IoT. And really just kind of give us a state of the union. Where are we with IoT right now? Kind of where have we evolved and where do you think we're going?
Yeah, no, definitely. So really good to meet and thanks for the opportunity. So as I said, we're part of Virgin Media O2 and Virgin Media and O2 have really come together combining mobile and fixed. And as you said, IoT and connectivity like 5G is really on a bit of a journey. IoT has been around for many, many years, connecting a number of things and devices that we work and live around. But what's really exciting is we're at the point where we're starting to see some real scale. And scale with IoT, with new low-power wide area network technologies. And then with the introduction of 5G, we can start to see IoT scale. And what that will mean is really helping businesses start to unlock their digital transformation. And that's why it's really exciting for me, thinking about some of those products and capabilities, those innovations. And as you unlock the digital transformation, we'll start to see that change and impact people's lives, our communities, and then make places much more sustainable as well.
Can you, just to bring it to life for us, can you give us an example of how you've worked with a customer
Great.
on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So thinking about IoT and 5G, one great example from earlier this year is some of the work we've been doing with on a topic called private networks and British Sugar. So private networks are these dedicated, ultra-secure mini-mobile networks that we put onto our customers' sites, really thinking about how they can use connectivity to start and begin their journey of transformation. So working with British Sugar, one of the largest sugar manufacturers here in the UK, making about 1.2 million tons of sugar, really they had a challenge of how do they provide the connectivity to get to know their things, their systems, their tools, their people, and then really begin a journey of how do they start to automate, improve, reduce waste. So we deployed this amazing private network that was running across 4 sites in the UK, so one of the first which runs across all their operations that produce the sugar. And then really working with them on a bit of a transformation journey, thinking about what are the things that this connectivity can enable by monitoring their factory and their automation line, to monitoring their people with maybe cameras and artificial intelligence. But what's really important is thinking about how can this technology really enable a change or an improvement in their production to produce more sugar, ideally reduce waste, and then from a sustainability perspective, reducing energy and the impact they're having on the environment as well. And it's a great example of going from a small trial and a proof of concept and explaining about what the benefits of the technology to then really rolling it out at scale as well.
That's a very cool example. You mentioned both of these, and I know I mentioned in the intro too, we're thinking about both business value here and environmental value and sustainability, right? Do you think, is one of those leading and the other one following?
Yeah, I think with sustainability, and we're all seeing the impact of climate change in our day-to-day lives, you're seeing as that then flows into businesses thinking about it, that's becoming more and more prevalent as well. I'd say still it's really important to have some business outcome and business benefit, and then in turn also in parallel show the benefits from a climate perspective, as most organizations will start to have really ambitious climate goals. It's like Virgin Media O2, where we have a challenge to have zero net carbon emissions by 2040 across our supply chain products and operations. All organizations are looking to do the same, but then also need to invest in these solutions with benefits, right? So they need to see benefits in their operations as well as sustainability.
And can you give us some examples on this environmental focus? What are some of the things that IoT and connected technologies can help with?
Yeah, so I think a great example of a deployment we're doing for one of our partners the other day was really in this current climate we're in now, it's twofold. One is obviously we're seeing the price of energy, and especially for businesses who don't have some of the restrictions on energy costs. And so we're hearing from customers and partners looking at how can they monitor and understand their energy usage in their building and environment. So we've been deploying an IoT solution for them. And this really helps them understand energy across their floor, their building estate. And then really, rather than just gathering the data, which is the first step with the Internet of Things, you really need to then monitor and then analyze using artificial intelligence and then really act on it. And then as you can start to act on that data, you can then decide, are certain windows open? Is the air conditioning running too much? Is there enough footfall to have this level of heating and so on? And then make those changes, which then will have a reduction in energy usage, a better operational experience, which is great from a satisfaction perspective, but then have the sustainability impact as well.
Are you seeing your customers ask you for more data or different types of data with this kind of sustainability lens on, and knowing that they're reporting on this, they're probably trying to think about their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Like, are they asking you for different data than they had been asking you from before?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're seeing that maturity and understanding of the data that, well, first of all, understanding, that where data is really important. And then we've been working with partners to feed in data from our IoT platforms into the right carbon calculators to then give our customers the right inputs as well. So yeah, definitely seeing much more maturity if you compare where we are today to maybe a few years back, where it's just much more around let's do a demo or a proof of concept to really measuring benefit now as well.
And how much are you seeing the evolution within your customers of them having the knowledge base around this already? Are you guys helping them understand those sustainability pieces more? Are they coming to you, like, help us, or more like, we've got the smart people inside now?
Yeah,
exactly what we're asking for.
Definitely. I think it's a bit of a mix. So with Virgin Media O2, we have a whole base of customers from really small, medium businesses, obviously the consumers, but then the enterprises, large enterprises and public sector. And each of those organizations, as you said, are investing in sustainability and their skills and their team. So in some cases, we can learn from them where they've done so much investment and have so many plans. In other cases, where we're using our ESG initiatives and plans to share best practices, case studies and examples, and then helping them define what to do as well. So it's definitely a bit of two-way. It's definitely not a one-way street. And that's a great collaboration where you can share your sustainability plans and goals and then learn from each other as well.
That's interesting. Are you seeing, what business benefits are you seeing for Virgin O2 from this?
Yeah, definitely. So like even thinking about the idea of e-waste as well. So e-waste being the largest stream of waste, electronic waste at the moment. We're seeing that as a big challenge even for our divisions where we're selling so many handsets and devices. How do you start to work through creating a circular motion where you're bringing those devices back through solutions like O2 Recycle, and we're really setting challenging targets. So, having 10 million e-waste or circular transactions by 2025, which will of course see then upside in improvement in waste, but then also benefits providing the right handsets to customers that want it, and then recycled handsets as well. So.
Is that also requiring you to kind of work with people up and down the supply chain to make sure that you're actually able to recycle those if you get them back? Or
yeah, definitely. I think that's where we've been thinking about when we looked at our ESG strategy and sustainability plans. It's not just about our operations and our network and making sure our network's running well. It's talking to our partners and really asking our partners to work with us and understand their supply chains to see how they're sustainable, but then actually making sure they can support us with that level of volume as we get there as well, for sure.
What would you look for in a good partner in this way? Yeah,
definitely. So I think we often, as we work with our partners through initial meetings to contracting, have requirements around ESG and sustainability, and then rankings, and we use tools to benchmark and score partners in a clear and transparent way as well. So, we can understand where our partners are, and often we're working with them to drive their sustainability goals and measures, which will then in turn, meet and help meet our 2040 target as well. So I think it's really important to have the collaborative relationship, use the right tools to do the measurements, and then work towards fixing and supporting them on their journey to be sustainable so that our overall solutions and products are completely sustainable as well.
Are you seeing more or new requirements like the RFPs that you're getting from potential customers around sustainability?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question as well. I think definitely if you reflect back in a period of time, if you think back over 5 or 6 years, you probably see that mentioned once or twice or as a bit of a token, but definitely now, in more cases than so, it's definitely much more of a weighted factor, making sure that we have our own sustainable plans, we have our own policies, and then really providing much more detail than we would ever have to do before. So and it's great to see because that keeps us really clear on our ambitions and goals, and then we can align and make sure we're supporting our customers as well.
And are you thinking of it as a bit of a competitive differentiator for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely if you're looking across the landscape and the industry, it's always a challenge for all the industry and operators to get towards this net zero emission for both their network, their supply chain, and then the products they own as well. So I think definitely we see this as a differentiating factor where, making that commitment for 2025 for our operations network and then 2040, which is 10 years before the Paris Agreement, gives us a really key talking point and an advantage at this point in time anyway. So,
where, for people who aren't quite where you guys are in this process, kind of where would you recommend to start? Like, what's a step one?
Yeah. So I think, in general, as we've seen with like the pilots with British Sugar or the work we were doing recently where we connected a hospital with the South London Maudsley Trust with the NHS, where we set up a private network with 5G connected hospital. I think it's all really starting with understanding the business outcomes that the customers are looking to achieve, be it linked to sustainability or operational improvements, and really thinking about the outcome and then not thinking, because all this amazing technology is great to play with, can create lots of fun news stories or PR opportunities, but it's really thinking what's the business outcome and then how can you make the first small step to show the benefit for then the organization to help create the case, right? Because all these innovative technologies and solutions require investment, and to create the investment and the need internally, it's to show the benefit in one simple way with one example, often a trial or proof of concept, and then working with customers to then scale it out so they can see clear KPIs with benefits of operational efficiencies or sustainability. And that's what we're doing as an example with the South London Maudsley Trust, where we were connecting up their teams with 5G-enabled connected tablets so they could actually perform and run more efficiently, and then measure before and after. Does that really make a difference or not as well?
And with those examples or any other ones that you've worked for, do they have to see immediate returns? Like, are they willing to give you a couple years to say, we'll pay more for 2 or 3 years knowing that we're going to be on this path towards 2030, 2040, or is that just too hard to get people to accept?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organizations and their investment profiles and what they're looking for. I think definitely most in the current climate and the challenges many organizations have, they really want to only invest in these connected technologies like IoT and 5G where they can see a clear benefit. Some will give a 12 or 18-month window knowing that these new technologies take time to adapt and they want to be at the forefront of those and really want to innovate as well. So, we see when we work with British Sugar, we work on a journey with them together with 15 or 16 different use cases and then look at what those could mean. But I think I think there is a bit of a window, but it's not open-ended. So I think people will not make the investment if they can't see the value in 1 year or 2 years. So.
And you mentioned this, and I know Brad Stone opened it up with the beginning of the day today. Like, we're in a really tough time. We're in a tough time in the UK, just in the world in general. Do you have any kind of positive lights coming out of that? Is there anything you think that this tough time in the UK is going to push you guys in a positive direction?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, yes, obviously we all relate. It's been a challenging couple of years and many events have happened that we've never planned for as an organization. So thinking about the pandemic, and it's really, or the current crisis where we have today, really thinking about each one as it comes to think, how do you react and support the environments or our customers now? So with the COVID-19 here and at the time of the pandemic, is really looking at how do we support the NHS with the vaccine program, providing with IoT connected devices or tablets. But then as we came out from the pandemic, thinking about how can 5G and IoT help with improving the healthcare industry by remote healthcare, consultations, or the transport industry with autonomous transport or hybrid working with 5G. So it's having a plan of how to solve the crisis here and now with innovative technology, but then also starting to plant the seeds of what you could do as you come out of the pandemic or the challenge as well. And then, making sure you have good control of your supply chain is always a key one as well.
We have a great group with us in the room today. What would you want to see your peers who are here in the room doing to push this forward more?
Yeah, great. So I think with 5G, IoT, and then sustainability, I think definitely we've got to think beyond sort of technology for technology's sake or doing things that will generate PR, but think about the business outcome and then start small. So we've always had these challenges where you have a big grand vision, try to create and over-engineer complex solutions, which then never materialize. I think our recipe for success is really keeping customer focus on the business outcomes or problems, and then start really small, create the benefits and the case, and then step up from there. So, take that step-by-step approach and that pragmatic approach rather than thinking, big bang, this is going to transform your organization in a day.
Last question. Anything else that they could do to help you?
Definitely. So I think it's having those conversations. So we like to always hear about your business problems, your business challenges. And I think what we found is it's just not one organization that can create that solution, right? You need a partnership. You need to create the environments where organizations in this room can come together. So I think it's really having those informally or formally through partnerships and collaborations, hearing about your problems, thinking about how we can all help work on those, and then creating projects and opportunities to showcase what we can do together. So I think that would be key. Coming forward with your challenges and let's work through them.
Sounds great.
Good. Oh, it's been like a quick fire interview.
There you go. I know, we did it. Sandeep, thank you so much.
No worries.
Everyone, join me in thanking Sandeep for that. Fantastic. Now for our next two joining us on the stage, Catherine Ainley is the CEO of Ericsson UK and Ireland, and Peter Vincent is head of connected systems for Scania R&D. Join them both on stage. Good luck with getting on the seats. Well done. Very graceful. Thank you guys both so much for joining us. So I want to continue the themes that Sandeep and I were just talking about. Catherine, to you first. Kind of where do you see the biggest and most exciting opportunities for 5G right now with dealing with these challenges around business outcomes and sustainability?
Yeah, and it's interesting listening to Sandeep because obviously there's quite a big overlap with what we do, and there's probably two things to think about. The first is how you can use the 5G network as a whole. So, as that's getting rolled out across Europe, but across the world, but across the UK as well. But then also some specific examples which Sandeep talked about really well around private networks. And I think they give us so many opportunities. It's quite hard to know where to start there. But I think to your point about what's driving it, I think that business efficiency and how we can reduce energy. 5G's, we're aiming to be 10 times more efficient with 5G versus 4G by the end of the year. So it's hugely more energy efficient, but it also gives you so much in terms of speed, the latency, and the things you can do with that from a business perspective, whilst also helping the sustainability agenda are just enormous.
Peter, what do you think about that? Do you think the business value is driving and the sustainability value is following, or where's the lead here?
No, I think it's a hard question because, as said here, we need to start small, but we also need to have the scaling option. So we need to have the products available for scaling. And I think for Scania, electric trucks are the next step. That is a step where we need to provide the product and scale up, but also provide the efficiency of the actual transport happening and understand how to make that efficient and how to make the step to electric vehicles. So I think it's the combination of both that gives the kind of the big impact rather than just one or.
And let's continue that example of the electric and connected trucks. Where do you see the opportunities coming from there? Like, where is the energy, where is the growth, and where are the challenges?
I think the challenges are many. One is energy, clean energy. That's a lot of talk about that. The other one is to understand which customer can actually electrify what transport in what time frame. And helping out with data from existing networks can help from that. So using the existing transport that they're running and using the measurements from that and then transforming that into, okay, let's take these routes and make them electrified. There's both money in that and it's sustainable and go from there.
Catherine, what about you? Any good examples that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, actually, just to follow on from that, Ericsson's part of the CEO Alliance, and one of the things we've been looking at as part of that is, there's going to need to be 800,000 electrified trucks across Europe, and to enable that, you're going to need about 400,000 charging points. And how do you? They're all going to need to be connected. They're all going to need to work together. So you start to get a sense of how central that connectivity is going to be to solving this problem, but also to just the opportunity that it gives us. And I think and one of the big themes that I bang on about is that it isn't about you build 5G and you build some connectivity and then you've got the answers. It needs to be part of integrated into all our thinking, into our innovation, and I think that's how you get the biggest impact, both from a business perspective and from a sustainability perspective. It all goes hand in hand.
Talk to us more about the integration of that rollout. Like, how are you dealing with, getting the companies and the leaderships on board? How are you thinking about the changes with jobs and the trainings that are needed for people as these technologies develop?
Fantastic question. So from a 5G perspective, yeah. So I mean, it's kind of, I think of it a bit of a snowball. So I think, there are so many different organisations in this infrastructure, plus of course government and regulators also playing a really key part in it, that you need it all to build on each other. So, you know, we see at Ericsson, we see that we've got a really key role to drive some of the idea and the thought leadership, and, you know, as a bit like Sandeep's talked about in terms of some of these pilots, and we've got, you know, lots of examples of those. But then the whole piece needs to sort of snowball on, and you need companies like Scania who are really embracing it to go, actually, this is how it can work. But you also need the infrastructure, but the infrastructure won't get built if it's not getting used. So it's sort of, yeah, and we saw with 4G, you know, if you rewind and you look at 4G, actually the thing that kind of really got 4G going was those applications and the usage. More from a consumer perspective, but you look at things like Uber, that's when everybody went, oh, I really get it now. And 5G will be the same, but I think enterprise is much bigger for 5G. Consumer's still important, but, you know, the opportunity for business is huge.
And any learnings from 4G that you're applying to 5G, especially as you think about enterprise?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the main ones are around, you know, actually that energy efficiency and how we can make it more sustainable. So say our target by the end of the year is that 5G will be 10 times more efficient than 4G, and we're at 9.3% more efficient at the moment, so we are well on our way. I think we need to go faster. I think what we saw with 4G is actually the countries that embraced 4G quickly and got the rollout out got ahead. So you look at Asia, and the countries which really got ahead with 4G got the benefit from it, and Europe is at risk of lagging behind Asia, and well, it is lagging behind Asia and America on 5G rollout.
And Peter, to you, I would love to hear more about how you guys are thinking about the implementation of this. You know, maybe a bit to my earlier question about jobs and how you guys are thinking about reskilling and retraining and what might need to be done, or you know, enthusing people about this shift.
Well, the shift from diesel to biofuel or electric, that's happening. I mean, we are investing heavily into that, on both parts, because both parts will be needed. Electric vehicles will be in the future, or that type of vehicle will be very important, but also in the transition period, we need to have biofuel. So that is also happening. But looking at it from the perspective of data connectivity, of course, that is also going to happen. And as a fact, at Scania R&D today, we have more software engineers than hardware engineers. So the shift has already happened, and we are more embracing making sure that our customers can take on the shift and that they can be sustainable, efficient, and profitable. And transport industry is a low-margin industry, so it isn't the margin that you will have to fight and ensure that you can bring customer value all the way through. So, and this will incorporate a larger portion of the workforce, not just R&D. This will be all the way out to the workshops, to the salesperson, and all of that. So enabling them with the tools of persuading customers to go electric, that is kind of one of the things that we're working with now. There we use connectivity data and tools to bring the sales cycle down for electric vehicles.
That's interesting, that the shift from kind of more hardware engineers to software engineers. Do you feel like that is changing a little bit of the culture of the company? Are you feeling like a little bit more of a tech company rather than a transportation company?
I have had the idea for marketing to say that we are a sustainable tech company right now. They haven't took that bait yet, but I think we actually are. And the fact is that we're coming into more of the tech companies' discussions from a point of view rather than to just be a provider of hardware. And that comes in also when we're working with autonomous vehicles. We will be in another part of the value chain because we will have to integrate the autonomous vehicles into the customer's IT system on a totally different scale than we are today.
You know, we're talking a bit about vehicles, but Catherine, what other examples have you guys been working on? Any other cool ones that you think bring this to life for people?
Yeah, some really good ones. I mean, just to finish, because I guess I didn't quite answer your question on skills, and that sort of prompted me as well. I mean, I think the software piece is really key, and also cloud. You know, so what we're also seeing is what connectivity enables you to do is to move a lot of your activity further towards the edge, and that changes that skill set as well, and cloud and software, rather than it just being a fixed hardware, which maybe 15 years ago would have been. But other industries, I mean, I think Sandeep's points around the pandemic are really interesting, because I think it's made people, all of us, think really differently about how we work. And as a result, it's really inspired quite a lot of big fundamental changes for some companies. And that's where you can see the benefits. I mean, if I look at some of the factories that we're working with, there's Hyperbat, which is an electric car battery manufacturer in the UK we work with. And one of the things they've done is they've introduced a private network, which means that they can work in a virtual reality world on a battery from hundreds of miles apart. And they can sort of go, you know, my non-engineering, go left a bit, right a bit, you know, can you change this? And they can work on that virtual reality world without having to travel, or in reality what was happening was sending lots of emails. So the pandemic's forced people to rethink what they do, but it's also made people go, actually, do I need to travel, or can I use the technology to change that?
And then that has environmental impacts as well.
Massive. It makes the company more efficient. I mean, the other thing Hyperbat are doing is they're looking to remove the wires from their production lines so they can move that around more easily. It makes it loads more efficient and effective, and the environmental benefit's huge.
That's interesting. Are you seeing an increased desire from companies post-pandemic to be like, okay, we're open to how can we do this more virtually? How can we do this in a different way?
I think so. I think it's still a little bit niche. So again, as you know, as Sandeep said, I think there's definitely these trailblazers who have got it and, you know, are embracing it and transforming their business and starting with the business problem and, you know, how can we be more efficient? But there's still lots of organisations who haven't quite got their head around it, and I guess that's the ask: is this is coming, and the benefits are huge. And
for those trailblazers, why do they got it? I thought it was a weird, funny way of saying it, but you know what I'm saying. Like, where is there like a trait? Is it the CEO? Is it the industry? Is it what is the thing that you think is catalyzing the people who are actually jumping on this?
It's really interesting. I think for some, it's, you know, you've got someone who's particularly does get it from a techie perspective. I think also, you know, the pandemic did make some companies go, oh gosh, we just can't do it. I mean, another really good example from within Ericsson is when we're doing rollout of 5G masts, well, masts in general, we'll send out drones now to create a digital twin of that mast and that tower, and then we can have different people work on it without having to travel. So, you know, sometimes, and while we could travel, it was much harder. So actually, you know, that came much quicker as a result. So I think it can be external triggers, but also some people are just embracing it more quickly. Do you agree with that?
What do you think, Peter?
Yeah.
Who are the trailblazers and who are the followers? I think that's a trick question, because I assume that people in this room are the trailblazers. Right? But the question is, how do we scale up the trailblazers, and how do we create the fight for sustainability, as we will have to fight, to be a fight not just about sustainability, but operational benefits and revenue. Because if we don't chase the revenue and we get the sustainability, there will be a lot of these events that we are seeing now. The COVID is maybe not a sustainability event, but for sure the war in Ukraine or the crisis in Bangladesh as it is right now. And those kind of events are coming to an extent that will be more events, they will be higher. And the resilience we build in by using more data and understanding the real situation, chasing the revenue, chasing the operational efficiency, not just for the small scale, but for the big scale. So the bigger question is, how do we go from 5G, IoT data into small scale experiment, into the big scale experiments that are kind of 1 + 1 is actually 3, or at least 1.1 for each of the involvements. So I'm not sure that there is an easy answer to it. I think it's a super complex problem.
Catherine, do you have an answer?
I think it's back to that snowball. I think, you know, once people see those trailblazers and get inspired, you know, you have to keep up, don't you? I mean, that's the joy of the competitive world that we live in. You'll get left behind if you don't. So there's a carrot, which is you can do all this fantastic stuff and you can be more efficient and effective and the sustainability benefit, but the sort of stick is if you don't, you're going to get left behind, and both your customers will question it, but also from a business perspective, you're going to have a higher cost base. So yeah, pays off.
So is it really the businesses now having to build that case to say, we have to make this change, we have to invest in this, or 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, we're not going to be in business anymore, or business is going to fall? Or do you think there's going to be more external pressures? Like, are there going to be, you know, policy changes? Are there going to be customer changes? Either of you, take it away.
No, I think that, as said previously also in the big room, the policymakers, they will raise the bar on what's acceptable lowest level. And I think that's what policymaker can do. It takes time, standardization, etc. And the trailblazers are on top, right? Mm-hmm. And the question is, how can we get the good innovations and the good things down as quickly as possible? Because that will drive our ability to save this planet as fast as possible. So by using the trailblazers and getting it down, I think that is. So I think that the area for business that are not either trailblazers or barely making it, it's going to be smaller. And I think we are seeing that already now. The pace of innovation is going faster. And as software is eating the world, as somebody said a couple of years ago, the cycle for software is now maybe sometimes a limiting factor for the change. It is not a 5G rollout. We have that. Electric vehicles will come. But the question is, how do we combine the different parts into values? And who is going to do that? And how can we find the trailblazers, scale them up? And policymakers is coming from the bottom, and the trailblazers from the top. So how do we make that happen faster?
Go ahead.
No, I was just going. I think the other thing is sometimes it can look huge, but I mean one of the other interesting pieces of analysis we were going through is actually if you look at sort of the 4 sectors where you can make the biggest impact around energy, manufacturing, transport, you can see that technology can drive a 15% reduction in their emissions from those sectors, but actually if you add 5G on top of that, you get another 5%. So, you can be quite targeted that there's certain industries where you're going to have a disproportionate impact from a sustainability perspective and almost certainly from a business perspective. And I mean, to put that into context, that is slightly more than the 33 million cars that are in the UK in terms of the impact that has on the environment and on sustainability. So that's a massive difference you can make.
It's a huge difference, yeah. One of the themes that's come out a bunch of times in the conversations around this is Europe's role with technology and whether Europe is does it have the stuff that is needed to make big tech companies work here, make big technological changes. I think there's been a little uncertainty about whether there's kind of some things holding things back here. I would say it's the opposite for sustainability. If you were going to say anywhere in the world is a leader in sustainability, Europe is the leader by far, and then the rest. I'm here from New York. We're trying to catch up still. Many other places are trying to catch up. What do you think about that combination of kind of like being a leader in sustainability, but maybe being a step behind in technology? Peter, what do you think? Do you think that's a good combination, or can one pull the other?
Yeah, I think that is the edge.
Yeah.
So have the sustainability edge and then be good enough on technology and combining those, and that's what we're trying to achieve. And I think that Europe has an advantage here, and if we can get use of that and get the partnership with the right people in the right room to take the right decisions, then we can speed it up. We will not get that from the policymakers. We should get that from us. And we need to take that kind of leap of faith of doing that. And we're part of a couple of alliances, and I think that is a good step. The next step is to get the people on the next level to actually see the benefits, see the revenue, see the combined roadmaps, and take them together and not fight each other and not do that. And I think that's super hard. So we are part of this journey, and we are trying to do it. It's just, it gets to be very, very harder to see the North Star on those. Scientific-based targets, super easy to see the North Star. What are the revenue targets that we want to do in these areas? Those are not so easy to see, and not how the partnership form around that. But I think we're seeing good examples, like we are doing with our competition about charging network. Yes, this is something we do together. This is for Europe. We put the money together and we just make it happen. More of those, I think, is going to see. And then we can go sustainable technology sector, maybe.
And Catherine, I know you're leading for UK and Ireland. What would you kind of say are the competitive differentiators for the UK and Ireland in this?
Yeah, and I think I'd probably disagree on one point, which is I don't think we are where we need to be on that 5G rollout. So I think particularly if I take that European view and you compare it to the US and Asia, we are behind, and we do need to get more, because actually, while you might have it in certain urban areas and you've got the private networks, actually that Asia and the US are racing ahead, and you do need it to kind of underpin it. I think that then also, that network will drive the innovation. and to some extent the market, things like the cost of energy, what we're seeing is we're seeing quite a big focus at the moment of lots of organisations, because the cost of energy goes up, they're suddenly like, this is much higher on our agenda. It's costing a lot of money. So, you know, as that happens, the innovation will kick in and the network needs to be there behind it.
Absolutely. I'm asking you the same question again because I don't think I totally got an answer.
No, I don't think I have.
But you answered Peter's. But thinking about the UK and Ireland specifically, what would you say are kind of? I know the energy you're spending the energy price in a good way. That's kind of forcing the renewables conversation here and forcing adaptation. But anything else do you feel like?
I think it's a really long answer, isn't it? I think so where are we? We are slightly ahead of Europe in terms of that. Well, certainly on a par in terms of the connectivity piece. So we're at about 50% coverage. Population coverage. I don't think we've really embraced how we're going to use it. I think from a sustainability perspective, I think there's other countries in Europe who've really got their head around it, probably the sustainability side, but maybe don't always have the connectivity to back it up. I'm always impressed when I go to Sweden because, you know, you kind of look at the connectivity and just the whole infrastructure. You know, they are really beginning to embrace it, but it'll be the innovation for me, that private sector innovation with a bit of help from government, that will really turbocharge it, and that's probably we've got to help that along, and that's our job, kind of
bring
collectively
together.
to do it. Yeah. So yeah, UK, okay, but I don't know. Sort of middle of the road.
Peter, imagine we're having this conversation in 5 years. What do you think is going to be the biggest difference?
First, I think that we will see the electric vehicles much more saturated, especially in urban areas, and where we will probably see that we're also starting to shut down parts of the city because walking is better, and we can actually see that transportation works. I think we also will start to see the autonomous vehicles taking offload, and that we can have transportation happening on off-peak hours, especially in condensed cities like London. You don't need the transportation on the street because you can run it on night. I think we'll actually be there. I'm an optimist. I don't think that will be as fast as everybody says, but especially on the autonomous side, it's going to take time. But for some parts, it will be there. And I think we have solved the energy crisis. We have realized that we have to accelerate the investment in renewable energy significantly, and we can't wait 10 years to build power plants, super big power plants. We will have changed that. So I think that those are 3 technology investment areas that we will see totally different from now. And then maybe the life is better.
Hope so. Fingers crossed for all of us. Catherine, what about you? What do you think in 5 years or so will have changed?
I think we will be at a point where you you'll take that connectivity for granted. You know, I really hope that you'll go everywhere, and that super fast, super low latency connectivity will just happen. And then that just enables so much. I think where you'll see the biggest impact the fastest, you know, some of those areas you've talked about, but they're the slightly more dangerous jobs, the jobs people don't want to do, and the ones that are kind of expensive and high risk. So you're looking at things like, you know, lorry driving cranes, for example, visiting remote sites in bad weather. You know, all of that stuff, we'll probably be turning around and going, gosh, we used to send someone out in a storm to go to a remote location, and, you know, wow. So I think it will make a massive difference to quality of life and business efficiency and safety.
Great. I want to ask the two of you the same last question that I asked to Sandeep. What do you need from the rest of the people in the room here? So you're thinking about other peers, other technology leaders. What would you love to see them doing? Peter first, and then Catherine.
Dare to be a trailblazer. Dare to experiment and find revenue fast, so you can be faster in teaching others. And I think take the opportunities to do cross-section and not stay just within your path, and find those kind of areas where you innovate faster than the rest of the world is innovating, and where sustainability, if we are on this path on not hitting 1.5 degrees, we will see more dramatic effects in our society. The planet will survive, but will the humans survive? That's the question. So take the opportunity to speed up the this. And don't do it on your own. Find a partner, find somebody in adjacent areas where you can combine your money, your talent, and your outcome, and help your customers to be sustainable and profitable.
Great. Catherine, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably come at it from two directions, actually. I'd say one is, what are the things that you can test and trial, to Sandeep's point, so you can kind of start doing it? What's the innovation you can feed in? But I think my other challenge would be, actually, I think we all need to take a step back and think of some of the problems we're trying to address in society. And there could be a completely different answer to many of the problems with the connectivity that we have. And sometimes, and they're the really interesting innovations where, honestly, they'll make the biggest impact on sustainability, but also, they'll be the business ideas of the future. So I think creatively and carve out the space to think about how this massive change in connectivity and the future can work for you.
That's great. It's an exciting opportunity.
Really exciting.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for joining me. Everyone join me in thanking Catherine and Peter. Great. And thank you all so much for being part of this think tank lunch. A huge thank you to Ericsson for sponsoring our conversation. Please continue to sit and enjoy, eat a little bit longer. We're going to be back to the main stage at 1:40. So have a little cup of coffee, and we'll see you back in the room very soon. Thank you all so much again.
Chickens. Please welcome back to the stage Brad Stone, author and senior executive editor for technology at Bloomberg.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a great lunch. We will be ushering in everyone else here for a jam-packed afternoon. During the afternoon sessions, we're going to talk about energy. We'll look at how green tech's future really is, and we'll hear from a regulator from the very influential Competition Market Authority of the UK. But first, let's hear from Sriram Viswanathan, Chief Executive, IBM UK and Ireland.
It is happening in our homes and offices, our schools, our stores, our cars, our planes, even in our pockets. It is happening in our supply chains and our security systems, in our workforce, in our weather, and in waves of the pandemic. Change. Change is all around us. Change is inevitable. There are those who are content to comfortably sit on the sidelines and watch change happen. And then there are those who lead it. Those who use technology in creative new ways. And what they've set their sights on changing will spark a radical reinvention of how we work and live. So let's get to it. Let's modernize business with the help of hybrid cloud. Let's simplify the way we work with automation and AI. Let's manage risk by taking cybersecurity threats head on. Let's activate a sustainability plan that's good for the planet and good for business. Let's fast forward to the future of computing and discover what's next. IBM. Let's create.
Welcome back. I have 5 minutes to inspire you about the possibilities of technology, so not a big challenge. So as you heard, my name is Sriram. I think everything around us is changing rapidly. Every single industry is changing, and throughout today, you probably heard lots and lots of presenters talking about the power of AI, cybersecurity, hybrid cloud, metaverse, and everything else, right? I do think in 20 years in this industry, I see a dichotomy between the startup companies that grew up in the digital space and the incumbents. And the incumbents' ability to change rapidly enough is, I think, our biggest challenge as tech leaders. So what I hope to do in the next few minutes is to give you some perspective and hopefully spark some thoughts. So why now? What is actually happening right now? Because necessity is the mother of all invention, right? So why now? We've got lots of external forces that are outside of our control. Hyperinflation, you've got cybersecurity issues, you've got social, political, economic issues that is driving change. And above all of that, we have this fundamental issue around digital skills, especially in our market. So all of this economic or external factors is going to make every single industry and every single organization change. But the potential of change, the actual impact of how we scale that change, I believe is down to us. So the moment is now. There are external forces that are going to make this impossible to ignore. So what are the benefits? Why do we need to change? I believe that the next decade, throughout the world, will reshape industries and will define winners and losers. And I feel that winners will have certain characteristics. First, they will challenge the status quo. They'll break down organizational silos and question why we do the things we do in the way we do them. Second, innovation will not be at the periphery of the business, but will be core to the business. Think about the big industry players that you work with, the incumbents that you work with. Do they really operate today in the UK that way, where innovation is at the center? In most of my experiences, at the periphery. Technology will no longer be a cost. technology will be seen as an asset. Technology will be the business. And lastly, I would say most companies will be a lot more open to creating ecosystems and digital platforms so that they can add and deliver much more value to their customers. So in this changing world, if that's what good looks like, and if you benchmark yourself against that list, which is a shortened list, if you like, where are we today? In my engagement over the last couple of decades, I can tell you the conversation with CIOs and chief digital officers hasn't changed that much. They spend a lot of their time talking about keeping the lights on, keeping the IT infrastructure and the systems running. They talk about how to keep the business users, the noise coming from the business users at bay. And on the periphery, we have these experiments with all the technologies you're hearing about today. So how do we scale this? Where do we scale? At the same time, the CEOs, we conducted a CEO study with 3,000 CEOs around the world. And they gave us a list of things that they would like from technology. Number one was scale and expedite innovation at pace, make it more relevant, allow us to invent products and services faster for our customers, help us change the customer experience. And the third thing they said to us is let technology help us really address the sustainability agenda. These were the three things that they said. So on the one hand, you have CIOs and CDOs trying to keep the lights on, and you have CEOs demanding a lot more. And how do you bridge this? So let me leave you with some parting thoughts for me. What we see as a storied company which has been in existence over 110 years. We're probably the oldest technology company that there is. What do we see in the market? We see in the UK market a lot of innovation. We have 44 unicorns that have come up, and we work with many of them. Just during the pandemic, we had 25 unicorns, over $1 billion companies. We are not short of innovation in our market. As UK Inc., we really have an opportunity to compete with the rest of Europe and with the rest of the world to reshape net new industries. There is increasing demand for us to do this. And so the real delta, the real potential for us is each one of you. It's the power of leadership in this tech industry. And technology is a great leveler. Around the world, as I've visited in various roles, what I've observed is countries and companies are leveraging technology to pull ahead of the competition.
presented by just the mobile technology that can help you program a lot of this. But I think even before that, there is an opportunity to make energy transition, energy efficiency work for everyone. And having worked in fintech before, digital inclusion is very close to my heart. We need to make sure that we include everyone in this transition. So that's why even before you go into mobile tech, you need to supplement that, complement that with energy advice offered on the phone, for example. That's why we are training a number of our customer service agents to be what we are calling home energy efficiency advisors. In many cases, they will offer basic advice around insulation of your loft. And in some cases, they will dispatch people to your homes to actually do an audit. And then in many other instances, it will come down to adoption of smart thermostats, smart meters, and if you have an EV, linking that to what's happening inside your home, and then really tapping into the opportunities around flexibility. So you use energy when it's cheap, it's also clean at the same time. All of that can be done through smart home tech.
So I think there is quite an interesting result from that, showing perhaps the size of the opportunity when it comes to the smart home. We can see that everybody, or the majority of people in the room, are aware, but perhaps don't have the technology and the tools themselves to kind of change their energy use, apart from quite crudely by just turning stuff off. So I think one of the things I wanted to ask you about that you were sort of touching on there is the kind of idea of energy independence, and perhaps things like rooftop solar, having an EV, what the smart home looks like, and also how that links to decarbonizing as well, and the longer term goals.
Yeah. So I think if you imagine a typical UK home, I go back to the, first and foremost, the opportunity around insulation. It's not on the glamorous end of decarbonization, but we still have the draftiest, leakiest homes in Europe. So you do insulation first, and then when you come inside the home, 80% of our homes are still powered by gas-powered boilers. Electrification of heat, and there are competing technologies there, electric heat pumps. There are targets around 600,000 by 2028. We have a long way to go there, but decarbonization of heat is an urgent imperative for us in the UK. Now we go on the roof, solar penetration. We are not the brightest country in the world, the sunniest country, but there is still a tremendous scope for solar. Right now, that's less than 4 or 5% of UK homes where solar is creating electricity, and that can increase many-fold. And when you go outside the home into, if you have a car, if it's an EV, then the interaction of that with what's happening inside your home becomes very interesting. You can have shifting of your consumption patterns. And for select users, the tech is now becoming bi-directional. So for instance, your EV then can have a battery which will sell energy back to the grid. Now the interaction with a smarter grid makes it even more interesting, because you have the makings of a new energy system. I think there are about enough cars in the UK, EVs in the UK now. If they were to become bi-directional, they can power more than 100,000 homes. So that opportunity is actually real and present now. We just have to design the right incentive structures, and we as OVO need to play a key role in addressing customer confusion, complexity around all of this. And it is complex at the moment.
So do you think owning an EV will be that tipping point for people towards caring more about their energy use, because you have this, car that you need to charge, and you're thinking about charging it at the cheapest time, whereas at the moment we don't really think, we just think about using energy when we need it?
Yes, and actually that's proven now. There are studies showing EV adoption does create greater engagement around time of usage, flexibility, and then the interaction between that and what's happening inside your home. And it will increase over the years.
And I'd like to return to the idea of the kind of just transition, and how we as the UK and OVO as a company kind of make sure that the smart home isn't just something that the wealthiest homes can take advantage of. You know, how do you incorporate that into social housing and different levels of society?
Yeah. Well, I think if you take decarbonization as a shared mutual agenda, it has to work for everyone, and it has to work as a team sport as well. Everyone needs to play a part, all stakeholders, and we have a key role as an energy supplier to make sure energy transition is an inclusive one. So for instance, we are working with local government authorities all over the UK to retrofit social housing. There are 15 live projects all over the country. We have in fact installed electric heat pumps in 1,000 homes across the country. And I think this is where government plays a key role, and there are some existing schemes which create the incentive structure for suppliers, as well as reduces barriers for people who may not be able to afford smart tech and smart decarbonization services.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because a lot of people say that you can't be driven by the lowest common denominator. You know, technology has to move forward and all of these things have to be developed at pace, but it's about sort of bringing everybody with you as easily as you can. And I would just like to go back a little bit to some of the things that you mentioned about electric vehicles and, you know, bi-directional charging. And how much thought do you give to things like how do you make sure that, you know, you must know a lot about people's behavior and how they interact with technology, and how do you stop that super peak in the evening where everybody comes home from work, plugs in their car, turns everything on in their home, and we get this giant peak in electricity demand? You know, what incentives are there that will stop that happening?
Sure. So I think the first thing there is driving engagement around energy usage. Again, fintech comes to mind, the whole realm of money management, and I was leading HSBC's digital bank, and we had so many different experiments, opportunities to drive people's engagement around saving outcomes, investment outcomes. The same tech is available in energy now. In fact, we have something called Energy Tracker, which is a mobile app-based solution which helps you make those decisions, exactly the ones you pointed out. The grid is pretty dirty and expensive between 4 and 7 p.m., for instance, so maybe not use your tumble dryer if you have one at that point. And then when you interact with your EV, then OVO as an energy supplier can actually stitch together an experience where you have a new tariff where we'll guide you around flexibility and the time of usage, which will then help you save money and also help you drive further engagement around your energy system and the home as a whole. Mm-hmm. And this is happening now. And it will become even more of a reality when smart meters can share data every 30 minutes. So imagine intraday peak management is a reality now, but at scale, it becomes very compelling.
Yeah. It's interesting, that kind of engagement that people need to have and that attitude that has to almost completely transform in energy, because before this crisis, you know, one of the things that the regulator Ofgem was trying to do was get people to switch supplier, because just saving 200 quid wasn't enough to make people want to you know, change. And then nowadays, you know, that would be a huge driver for people. So it's interesting to see that kind of shift. And do you think that people are interested in their app and looking at, you know, their energy use, or do they want to just, you know, use that term set and forget?
I think it's a combination. As you rightly point out, the energy crisis is acting as a forcing mechanism for all of us to really confront our energy usage. Energy Tracker, the app I mentioned, we've seen a 250% increase in adoption and just the eyeballs around it. But as I said, this needs to be a combination of digital technologies as well as hand-holding for people who are perhaps not in that digital fold. And I think a combination of that then can drive engagement around energy, which is about smarter consumption, not necessarily using less, but using better and smarter.
Yes, I think when we were talking before, you mentioned how efficiency can kind of help you preserve your lifestyle rather than this feeling of having to cut back on everything and not be able to do the things that you want to do that involve energy. And I guess maybe for the final question, what do you think the lasting impact of this crisis will be? Do you think it will give the energy efficiency, the kick that it needs to get going? Because we're not really hearing that message from government. And what are your expectations? We were talking a little bit before we came in about what people will do this winter. Do you think they'll use less energy overall, maybe at the beginning and throughout?
Well, I think the polls suggest that is true. People will be more mindful. But let's go back to the crisis and the long-term opportunity. I think that's where I started, and that's the over-mission to power clean energy for everyone. And I think the long-term way out of the crisis is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, to drive adoption of alternative, renewable technologies. There's a lot being said about production, supply security, generation. All that is great. Our job as OVO is to make sure, as a retailer with no upstream assets, we want to make sure that we stand for consumers. We reduce complexity, we create seamless experiences so that people in their homes and around the home can really confidently embrace what new technology has to offer. And I hope this crisis acts as a catalyst for all of that.
I think it would be really interesting to come back and ask you these same questions in maybe a year or two and see how things have changed. Yeah. But I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, Raman. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Please welcome to the stage Tanya Bowler, founder and CEO of Elvie, and Daniel Folkman, SVP for Business at GoPuff, and Bloomberg's Alex Webb.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for sticking around to follow this conversation. I'm delighted to be joined by Dan and Tanya, and we're going to be talking about how there is something of a reinvention of consumer tech. And it's great that we have both of you because you come at it from slightly different angles. On the one hand, of course, GoPuff is delivering food to our doorstep in 5 to 15 minutes at times, and you guys are at a slightly different price point. Maybe, Tanya, I'll start with you. You're in the health tech space, which is something that a lot of massive tech companies are looking at and doing things in. Where you guys are different is you're doing a product that is regulated. And I'm wondering how you firstly start selling that to investors to begin with, and then approach it. And how then, if there's a big company like Apple or Google, you guys are a big company, I mean a huge, massive monster mega tech, what learnings could they take from your experience?
Yeah, and just hi everyone, by ways of background. So I created Elvie, which we're building the first global tech brand for women's health. So we create connected devices, and Alex said a lot of them are in the regulated medical space. Our dominant category is breast pumps. So we've created the world's first silent wearable breast pump. In terms of scale, we're at about $100 million revenue, and 80% of our revenue is from the US. So I think in terms of your question of what makes us different, yes, we're about consumer tech, but I think we're part of a new generation of what we're calling personal health tech or consumer health, which is bringing together those traditional verticals of consumer tech and health. So what does that mean? It means really the products and services that we make we have to adhere to quite strict clinical standards and regulation. But we see this as a positive because it creates a lot of defensibility. But it's really about being innovative in how we market and sell it. So that's really doing it as a consumer lifestyle brand.
So when you say innovative in how you market and sell it, what would be different?
Well, our first category is pelvic floor health. Often women would wait till they have a yucky health problem. They go and see a doctor. The doctor will prescribe some sort of treatment. And generally, medical devices are not designed. They're designed in quite a utilitarian way. So we've designed our products which actually it sounds so obvious, but they're customer-centric, women-centric. So women actually enjoy using the products, and then therefore they talk about it more. But in terms of the branding, for example, we launched our breast pump on a catwalk at London Fashion Week. For us, our social following is about 500,000, and we work a lot with influencers. That's not the traditional way to market a medical device, which would normally be go to medical conferences and talk to physicians.
Dan, for you guys, it's a space that has exploded in the past few years, obviously during lockdowns. But when you set about, I think your company's 6, 7 years old now?
9.
9, my bad, I apologize. This is why we usually have editors. It was not as hot as it is now. How, in those early years in particular, do you go around selling the product? And it's quite a capital-intensive business, at least from day one. What was your sort of an initial pitch?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit of history on the company. As Alex mentioned, it's a 9-year-old company. Started out in Philadelphia, back in the States. And the impetus of starting the company was really like, how do you make convenience more convenient? Because at the time, this is 2013, you don't have anyone really in the delivery space. I think today, all the companies that we know and order all of our goods from were just starting or didn't exist. And so the big difference in how GoPuff started versus like what you've come to know as third-party marketplaces is GoPuff is a fully vertically integrated model. So we operate our own micro-fulfillment centers. They're 8,000 to 10,000 square feet. We own all the inventory that we sell. In the US, that's over 4,000 SKUs. In the UK, it's a little bit less. And then we deliver goods to people in under 20 to 30 minutes, wherever they are, whatever they need. And that range of goods is everything from snacks, ice cream, and alcohol to baby, pet, beauty products, over-the-counter medication, things like that. When we started the business, the trend that we saw in technology, really out of Silicon Valley, was like building these asset-light marketplaces that connected couriers and merchants. And the problem with that was it's very hard, as we're seeing today, for a third-party business model to actually produce cash. And that's why you see a lot of third-party players start to invest in ancillary businesses. But also, you can't control the customer experience because you're delivering goods that someone else owns and manages. And so our founders, when they started the company, really wanted to make sure that they could control the entire customer experience and that the business produced cash. And so for the first 3 years, it was actually profitable, at which point we started taking on venture capital to expand the network, both domestically and globally. And today, where it sits is GoPuff covers around 1,000 cities across the US and the UK. We operate a little over 400 micro-fulfillment centers. We actually own over 400 liquor licenses. So there's a heavy infrastructure component to the business between the buildings that we manage, the liquor licenses that we own, the technology that we've built. When we started, as you mentioned, we pioneered this instant commerce space. There was no off-the-shelf tech in terms of receiving product, picking and packing, and then routing and dispatching in this like micro or hyper-local environment. So we think what we've built is what the rails for the future of commerce will look like as consumers shift from the 2-day and 2-hour delivery to this concept of instant procurement of the goods that they want.
And that is, on a very high level, something that you guys both have in common. You are making, well, in your case making, and in your case delivering things, and you have fulfillment centers and manufacturing facilities, R&D, all that stuff. Do you think that era, the platform generation of companies that we saw certainly 6, 7, 8 years ago, is that dead, or has it outlived its usefulness, and the companies that were created in that era and are still around are the ones that are going to survive, and maybe we won't see so many new ones? Tanya, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are similarities. They're both very capital-intensive businesses, and you have to constantly be analyzing your value chain to see where can you maximize profitability. So even though I agree it's better to go deep, there's still a lot of opportunity to be looking at that platform play. So for us, it's about, can we use the same back engine, the same infrastructure to support women at different life stages with different problems. So I don't think the platform play is kind of going anywhere.
In that sense, is it more a platform to link them to your products rather than just a platform in and of itself?
Yeah. I don't know for you, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would think about it a little bit differently, personally. I think the way that platform has been described or defined over the last 10 years has been very asset light. I think there's this company that many people may have heard of called Amazon that invested, $20 billion in infrastructure for $60 billion.
They're the arm of AWS.
Yeah. A few people have heard of them. But they've invested tens of billions of dollars over the last 2 decades into infrastructure to build the largest global platform I think we've come to know, right? And if you remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the Amazon eBay debate was a hotly debated topic, and everyone was asking, the Amazon team why they were not going to this third-party marketplace model, right? How many people still use eBay? So I think the idea of investing in infrastructure up front in a very heavy way, that infrastructure pays back fairly quickly, and it's a one-time investment. And if you can manage that, you can avoid or endure a lot of things that are out of the control of many companies that, like an asset-light marketplace that owns nothing, can't endure. And what you can then do, which I think Amazon's kind of created a blueprint for this, is you can then take that infrastructure and open it up to enable whatever services you're uniquely positioned to provide for other types of companies and brands. And so I think to Tanya's point, like it's just an evolution of what a platform means. And I think companies who are betting on infrastructure early are the ones that will win long term.
And I would agree with Daniel, I mean, in terms of profitability on the value chain, but the problem is often investors, right? Particularly venture capitalist investors, they get very put off if there's asset heavy, right?
Yeah.
Have you found that as well, and particularly what's going on, right, with cash and so on?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the beginning, and I'm sure you guys went through something similar, but in the beginning, trying to explain to investors that we owned inventory and had buildings, like you would watch their eyes pop out and their heads explode, like in the conversation. And it was the investors that we were fortunate enough to bring on, who have been great supporters, who bet on us early. And now you look at the tides have turned, especially with this, like, whatever you want to call it, an economic downturn, recessionary environment, depending on who's speaking. Companies that own infrastructure and manage the end-to-end or deep down the value chain are the ones that can survive what's going on. And the ones that and if you don't own anything, how do you make money, right? Like, we joke that, I'm sure you guys are similar, like, we buy products and we sell it for more than we buy it, right? Like, that's the core model. That's why the business works. Then we found unique ways to actually deliver those goods and do things differently. And so the investment community, we believe, has come around because we've shown that this model works. But in the beginning, it was definitely a challenge.
That idea, buying something more cheaply than you sell it for, clearly you guys were a big beneficiary in terms of demand, I assume at least, from the lockdowns. That this is when we saw the explosions of not just you guys, but in the UK we have Getir and Gorillas and plenty more besides. That was a very competitive time, but there was also a lot of demand. Were you still selling stuff for more than you paid for it, or were you just saying we're going to stomach a whole bunch of losses right now and gain share?
So I'd say two things. One, we never believed in raising venture capital dollars and then subsidizing acquisition costs. That's never been our model. In fact, the percent of revenue that we spend on marketing is like astronomically low. And most people would be very surprised when you see that, when you look at some of the other companies out there. That's an approach that a lot of other companies in our space took, and I think we can see that that's not worked for them. The second thing is anybody can sell $1 for 99 cents. That's not hard. We don't do that. We think pricing is important. We think promotion is important, but within reason. And ultimately, like, we want to provide a service for consumers that is a good value purchase for them, especially now more than ever. The pandemic itself, yes, it drove demand in the broader delivery landscape because people couldn't leave their homes. But really what it did for us was it accelerated the exposure to the breadth of our assortment for consumers. So we carry, like, there's no other platform in the world that you can get fresh pizza, beer, baby products, cleaning supplies, and home essentials in one basket for one delivery fee, besides us, right? And that's what it exposed to consumers during the pandemic. And so that's really where we were able to continue to expand categories. So yes, it was demand, but it was really more exposure to, like, you can get all of these things delivered in one basket, and that's really where we saw success.
There was also on the other side, and I'm going to come to your lockdown experience in a second, but real estate presumably was easier to get at a cheaper price than might otherwise be the case. Were you able to lock in some long-term deals, or is that going to start correcting soon?
I mean, look, we've always been very prudent with how we approach the deal-making side of things, whether it's real estate, acquisitions, fundraising, et cetera, and we're always looking for the right deal. The benefit of the way that the business is structured is the majority of our markets, the success are not predicated on, grade A real estate. Right? We need real estate that puts us with close proximity to consumers, but effectively we build networks in every city. In London, for example, we have 21 micro-fulfillment centers covering the breadth of the city. So we're designing these networks very thoughtfully to make sure that we can get goods to people wherever they are, wherever they need it. And it doesn't have to necessarily be, prime real estate. Certain exceptions in major cities, and it's going to be more expensive, but that's never been kind of like an issue for us. So the pandemic, we were focused very much on get your goods in stock, make sure they're there when consumers need it, and deliver as fast. And we were the only company that was able to maintain our delivery ETAs or SLAs for consumers during that time.
You guys were clearly at the hard end, I assume, were at the hard end of some of the supply chain crunches. You're an electronics business. Like, can you talk me through when you first started to realize that was happening, and then how you adapted?
Yeah, so during lockdown, as you know, the tech sector obviously did quite well, and particularly health tech did well, so we were growing really quickly. But then it was last May, I think, the first component, the microcontroller, obviously the brains of our product. You know, even with hardware, it's always about forensic forecasting, right? But even if you get it right, even if you get the demand planning right, what you can't predict is obviously when suddenly there's this frenzy around component shortages. So even if we've talked to the component manufacturer and they're like, sorry guys, we love you, we love LV, but there's this multi-billion-dollar tech company that's kind of been our customer for years and jumping to the front of the queue. So it was really difficult. Essentially, we were inventory controlled last year. How do we keep the products on the line? I think anybody working in electronics last year had a really hard time. And then that was sort of compounded by the fact that then the retailers, our customers, started also panicking because they were out of stock and sort of behaving quite irrationally, either saying, look, we need all your pumps or we're going to delist you and so on. And then they started placing, and we've seen this, I think, across the sector, this is more Q4 last year, really high purchase orders and so on, which then has sort of artificially affected all the forecasts. And then what we kind of knew was happening, but obviously all the Asian manufacturers in Q1 have now ramped up the supply of all those components. So we've seen a sort of 180-degree turn from a complete crunch on the supply chain to now actually a glut on various components, and also hit obviously by consumer confidence. So it's been to keep using the word headwinds is a bit of an understatement. I feel like we're...
What does that do for your pricing? So if you know, presume you can't deliver as many as you might have wanted, were you then able to charge more to your channels, or do you keep the same price and you just take a hit on the margin, and then it clearly evolves in a different direction now?
I mean, the aftermath of the pandemic has just been brutal for margins for most companies, but also as well as obviously the supply chain issue, freight, air freight, and even power outages in China and so on. Like many companies, we had to make the decision to actually increase our prices. Which is a sort of natural, obvious response to inflation. But it's the more midterm thing we need to do is obviously be looking at our product mix, making sure that we're able to offer products and services at a slightly lower price point and adapt.
And so when the lockdowns ease, what was the sort of impact you saw on demand? Because I guess to begin with, you have a sort of return to almost solid state economics, and this is how the market should be, hopefully. But then that rapidly changes with inflation, the inflation story. Like how long did that happy period last, and then how did it change afterwards?
I don't know if we've had a happy. Whenever you're loss-making high growth, we're growing 80% year on year. It is that analogy of a car driving 100 miles an hour, and every part is changing on the inside. So as soon as we start getting the margins right, and then something else has been sort of hitting us. But I think what's happened this year, which is the big learning, obviously, is because any loss-making consumer tech company as well, an existential issue is your investors and to what extent you can secure funding from them. And because that has also shifted the attitude towards consumer tech and so on, it's pushed us all to pull forward on terms of profitability. So we were planning to become profitable in Q4 next year. Now we're going to become profitable in January, which is quite a big change, but really quite exciting as well.
Before I pose you a similar question, we did actually have a Twitter poll, which I hope we can bring up, where we asked, and clearly it's a Twitter poll, so don't afford it too much empiricism, where we asked people what habit that they adopted during lockdowns have they retained or maintained since then. And grocery, food delivery comes up, perhaps no surprise, video conferencing up top of the list. But all of the above is about 20%, so we can infer perhaps that 45% have kept grocery and food delivery. I don't know if we then also infer that 55% have not. What does that, when you guys came out of the lockdowns, was there a bit of a course correct? And what were the meetings like where you first started to see some data points that said perhaps we need to change things?
Yeah, well, first, I think the important thing to note about a survey like that is that 55% probably hasn't tried grocery delivery, especially in our category.
To be clear, it said, have you retained?
Oh,
Look, it's a Twitter poll. We did not
to question the validity of the poll.
It's
more what I was saying is that the adoption rate in our category is still super low, right? There's still so many people. It's still less than like 10% in the U.S. at least. I mean, some other countries have seen faster adoption in Asia and things like that. But like grocery, convenience, alcohol, these are slow adopting categories to delivery. In terms of like the adoption rate during pandemic, post-pandemic, like I said, what we really saw was the cross-category pollination of the consumer behavior. And one of the stats that like we've spent a lot of time focusing on is we see that consumers who are shopping 8 or more categories on our platform are 22 times as valuable.
I'm going to bring you back to the question.
I'm going to get
because we've got
answer.
time on the
no
clock.
problem.
So did you start to see a slowdown in demand, or was it a slowdown of growth? What was the actual behavior?
We're seeing a shift in behavior. And so what you're seeing is that consumers are shopping more frequently, spending less. And this was a behavior we were starting to kind of sniff out going into this recessionary environment, where that $150, $200 grocery trip is starting to go away because there's a lot of waste component to it, and consumers are now buying what they need when they need it. And so that's really the shift in behavior that we're starting to see: more frequent trips, less spend on a per trip basis.
And what does that mean for you guys? How does that pick at your model essentially?
I mean, look, the impetus of the model was to get people goods in 30 minutes or less, right? So if people are shopping us on an ad-needed basis, that speaks to our initial thesis 9 years ago that consumers wanted to have these things, like the access to these goods at their fingertips, in which they didn't have it before. So I think the model's built for that, this hyperlocal logistics model, and I think we expect that behavior to actually accelerate over the next 18 months.
And it's funny because we're completely different businesses. We've had exactly the same behavior change with consumers since May. So so we're still number 1 in breast pumps in the US, but women are just spending less. That category has really shrunk.
You alluded to the need to bring forward profitability, and it gets another question I was keen to tackle, which is just what the capital environment is like at the moment, and whether it's, I don't think either of you, well, I don't know, but if you needed to raise capital right now, how do you think it would be, and what sort of feedback are you generally getting from your existing investors? Tanya, maybe I'll start.
We did actually, unfortunately, have to do a small internal round, which we've just closed. I mean, LV it's like many startups in the UK over the last 6-7 years, it's just been incredibly easy to raise money, and it's been a very easy process. And this year, everything literally changed overnight, right? So from having venture debt providers who are like desperate to give us term sheets, and then suddenly they're like, nah, don't take it personally, but we're not doing anything in the consumer space, anything with discretionary spend, and particularly anything which is loss-making. So we have seen that real shift in the UK. I don't know what it's like in the US, but absolute laser focus on profitability. For us at LV, I think the fact we've managed to bring that forward, and to your point about the assets, because we've got the underlying unit economics right, that we can actually get there within a couple of months has really helped. But I would, my general advice to anybody would be just to try not to raise money in this environment. Yeah. You're seeing a lot more downside protection, terms which we haven't seen on term sheets for a long time around liquidation preferences and so on.
Yeah. What does that mean for hiring? Does it have an effect of people going, well, actually my options or my if they have an equity piece, not worth as much as maybe we thought they were going to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, we haven't done a down round. We've had to continuation, but I think a lot of companies are obviously doing down rounds. I mean, the number of times my board members keep mentioning Klarna to me, and I keep saying, we're not Klarna. Yeah. we don't need 9%.
Much more complexity in that one, but...
I mean, I think you were saying before, you guys don't need to raise money, but I think with the last round was valued you guys at 15 billion.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe the hiring thing is perhaps pertinent for you guys as well, because do you have to come up with new valuation internally? So when you're telling people how much their options and things are worth, like how do you negotiate that element?
Well, look, I mean, I think we're fortunate to be well capitalized and not have to go to the market. I think it's not a good time to raise money and probably won't be for a while. The fortunate thing for us is we expanded a lot over the last 2 years, both infrastructurally and from a personnel perspective. So we're not in a position where, we're hiring hundreds of people right now. We feel like, we've gone through some major cost-cutting exercises over the past few months because, similar to what Tanya said, it's fortifying the balance sheet today and putting yourself on a self-funded plan to achieve profitability. We're doing the same thing. But we have a really talented and big team. So we're not in the market looking for a ton of roles, with maybe the exception of our technical side of the business. And we still believe there's a ton of upside on the business. So we haven't had real challenges on that front.
And we were just talking about this earlier, right? Because you've had to withdraw from Spain. I think that's public, and we've withdrawn from China. So I think it's just the environment at the moment. It's just making you focus much more on the short term rather than the more mid to long term strategic objectives.
Are there also some opportunities, created by this? Perhaps weeding out some of the companies that perhaps don't have as resilient a business model, or is that wishful thinking from, that you would be pitching to your own investors?
Yeah, it creates a burning platform, right? So, similar to GoPuff, we've grown so quickly, right? And then things slow down slightly. So actually this burning platform it forces you to be more agile. Like, how can we fix our product mix? How can we diversify faster? And also even on the business model. So how can we move away from discretionary spend? So our breast pumps, for example, can be subsidized on health insurance in the US. So trying to look for more predictable income such as that.
I realize I failed you as an audience by failing to ask if you wanted to submit questions. We've got about 2 minutes left, so if you have any questions, please race to import them. This is entirely my bad. I apologize. I'm going to pose the same question to you. How are you finding the competitive landscape is shaping up, given the new headwinds?
Yeah, I think, look, we had the experience of a very unique competitive landscape over the last few years.
In the UK alone, there are a dozen companies.
Exactly. For 6 years, we had no competition. And then I think about 18 months ago, you probably had 30 instant commerce players globally. Today, there's like 4 or 5 left, right? We're seeing consolidation. We're seeing a lot of businesses go under. The infrastructure wasn't built properly by a lot of companies because it was done too fast, and they were using the dollars incorrectly, in our opinion. And so we think the consolidation will continue, and we think it's a huge opportunity. If you manage a better business, and to Tanya's point, you're forced to think differently about the business in this environment. We think it puts us in a position coming out in a few years as the global leader in this space, undeniably.
If there needs to be a roll-up, would you guys have the capital, or would you need to go and find money elsewhere?
We feel really good about the business that we've built. I don't think we see a need to expand by acquiring competitors, right?
Although that is what you've done historically.
Yeah. But that was entering a market, and that was before this wave of these players. So we were actually one of the first to make that kind of move, and it was before some of the irrational valuations we saw in the space.
And I would say actually it's the same. So femtech, women's health tech, there's been a plethora of early stage startups. But what you're seeing here in the UK is particularly the ones that are not revenue generating. They're the ones who are being punished the most in terms of the investor climate. So unfortunately, quite a few are going bankrupt. So similarly, there's definitely a lot of opportunity for consolidation. I think also there's increasing amounts of funding, to your point exactly, for doing that mop up.
We do have a question. I'm going to slightly paraphrase it. The question is, how would you describe the impact of the pandemic on consumer tech? What I'd actually be interested to ask is whether it benefited your company and whether it benefited your industry. I'll start with you, Tanya.
A simple answer, no.
Okay.
Well, I think the impact was early adopters became the norm, right? Like that's what we saw in a lot of space. I think undoubtedly it impacted in a positive way both our industry and our company.
Well, thank you both for joining us on stage, Tanya Moeller and Daniel Folkman from GoPuff and LV respectively. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the panels this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Tom Pei, CEO and founder of Waymap, and Bloomberg's Amy Thompson.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I have the CEO of Waymap, Tom Pei, with me. So the idea for the app originally was to help the visually impaired navigate places like the subway or the underground. How are you positioning the company now?
Well, when I founded Waymap, I was really inspired by something that Steve Jobs said when he was trying to get the iPhone through at Apple. He said, if we can make this work for blind people, it will work for everybody. And pretty much that's what we're doing with Waymap. We've designed something that started with solving a real problem for blind people like myself, but actually is something that's really needed in many verticals. So it's a very commercial product, and it is one that's going to be extremely profitable.
So how does the technology work? Because you say it doesn't rely on GPS, which is how most mapping apps, you'd expect them to work. So what technology does it rely on?
Well, basically, because we use the principles of inclusive design, so we started out trying to design for the most difficult user we took advanced technology that was available, that was being used in the military space and in asset location space, and we turned that into something that really converted your mobile phone into a very accurate navigation device. And really what it does is it takes the sensors on the phone. They're not very reliable, they're not very accurate, but they give you a reading of the direction you're going in, if you're going up or you're going down, and so on. And by also measuring the step length, by knowing your step length, we created an algorithm that when we put it against maps, can predict your next step to within 1 meter. So in other words, we can keep you to within 1 meter accuracy and 10-degree heading accuracy all of the time. And because all of the maps are on your phone, and because the software is on your phone, if your mobile phone company loses you, or you don't have access to Wi-Fi, then you don't need it. It works. Now, if it's there, of course we use it, and it helps us out. But we also put in many other things into the phone that allows it to help people. And with disabilities, we just simply then stack on top of the basic device all of the extra features that different forms of disabled people need. But actually, most of those are really cool for the ordinary person, such as, like I use a mobile phone. Everybody uses a mobile phone because it's accessible for disabled people. There's some really cool features in it.
Like what are some of these features?
Well, in terms of for blind people, for instance, the most important thing is that you get an instruction on time, and that the instruction is clear, and that the instruction makes sense to you, right? Mm-hmm. So when I'm being trained to use a white cane or use a guide dog, I learn certain tricks about how to get around. What we do is we harness that, and we create mental maps so that, simply by saying straight ahead, rails on your left, right? It creates a mental map of where I am and what I need to do, and it allows me. If I'm, for instance, so the Washington Metropolitan Police, for instance, have asked us if we can develop a product to help them to find older adults who get lost. And the answer is yes, we can, but in fact we can put into the system something that will prevent people from getting lost in the first instance, such as being able to off-ramp, being able to identify markers around you, having very simple aids within the phone that allows you to solve simple problems. But if you take it then for, say, for me, one of the awful things was that I used to always have to ask my wife to take me to the supermarket to buy stuff. So what we've done is we've developed a system, because we know where you are to within 1 meter, and we know the way you're looking to within 10 degrees. We know if you're in the wine aisle or in the coffee aisle. Oh, wow. And we know if you're looking at the white wine or the red wine, and so on, yeah? And for me, that solves a great problem. But actually, for retailers, we are finding that they're really excited about this because it gives them greater opportunity to do proximity marketing.
So the app is free for users. So these retailers and municipalities, et cetera, these are your paying customers.
Yes, absolutely. So it is the service provider, or as we call it, the venue owner, that pays for it. It is relatively inexpensive in terms of marketing budgets, and at this present moment in time, we are rolling it out across the entire greater Washington metropolitan area. So that's the tri-state area in DC, and DC will become the first city in the world to have a really inclusive transportation system that can be used by the 10 million visitors that come to DC every year. So, for instance, the mayor's office, I mean, you can imagine the bureaucracy in DC and the security and so on. But the mayor's office and all of the tourism people are really, really excited about this. But even more importantly, we can now take this into the area of social care. We can get people who have dementia, people who have learning difficulties, and so on. So we take something that will work for everybody, that increases the experience, and we have in there features that allow people like me to be able to enjoy the city the same as everyone else.
Well, great. Well, that's all of our time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Catherine Ainley, the CEO of Ericsson UK and Ireland.
Hi everyone, thank you, and it's great to be here today at the end of quite a remarkable summer. I think if ever it brought home about climate change, the sort of 40 degrees that we saw in London for the first time really made us realise how urgent and important everything is. So I'm here today to talk to you about connectivity and climate change, and a little bit about Ericsson, both in terms of what we're doing, but also what we're doing with customers, and hopefully inspire you on what some of that connectivity can do more broadly as well. So before I start, because not everybody knows who Ericsson is actually, we don't make mobile phones, which is what I get quite a lot, not anymore, but what we do is create, develop, manufacture lots of the infrastructure and software that powers particularly the mobile networks. So in the UK, for example, we're working with all the 4 big operators to roll out 5G. So I'm going to spend quite a lot of time unashamedly talking about 5G and connectivity and what that can enable. So yeah, a little bit on that. But I'm going to take this from 2 angles. The first is sort of what Ericsson is doing internally, to sort of share a little bit there, and what we're doing with our customers, so kind of the direct impact that connectivity is having on climate change. But also, more excitingly, what that connectivity can do and how it can inspire and innovate and really help to tackle some of the bigger issues in the world around us. So if I start with Ericsson as a whole, we are well on our way to our net zero journey. By 2030, we'll halve our net zero emissions, and our target is to be net zero throughout that value chain by 2040. And if I sort of talk through a couple of practical examples to bring that to life, one of the things we've just done is redeveloped our factory in the US to reduce our energy costs by energy usage by 24% and costs. But that's also gone to 100% renewable energy. And how we've done that is we've automated the factory, we've introduced lots of connectivity, lots of autonomous activities, and using our own technology to really drive that sustainability piece, but it also means that we can produce more quickly. And manufacturing is one of the areas that you can really see the benefit. But if I move on a little bit more from our technology, one of the other places we can have an impact, and that's really critical to us, that we spend lots of time thinking about, is what we call breaking the energy curve. So if you look at 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G, each one has increased the amount of connectivity that we've had, and it's increased the amount of data, and we've all done more and more with this technology. But also what's generally happened is the energy usage has increased kind of on a level. So we've gone from 2G to 3G to 4G, and if we carry on with 5G, actually the amount of energy that that's going to use for all these fantastic new applications that I'm going to talk about could just carry on increasing. So the other thing, as well as what are we doing internally, we're also spending lots of time with our customers on how can they reduce their energy usage. Bring that to life for you a little bit. We have co-developed a radio, so as well as sort of how we produce that radio, we've worked with Vodafone in the UK to produce a radio. So a radio, for those of you who are a little bit less technical, is the thing that you see when you think of a mobile phone mast. The radio is on top of it. And that uses 42% less energy within 5G for Vodafone, and up to 55% less energy. So we're constantly looking for how can we get that better connectivity and that better speed without just using more and more energy. And in fact, we're targeting having 5G being 10 times more efficient than 4G by the end of the year within our products. So you can see actually this is a really important thing that we are driving forward. However, what I get really excited about is what can 5G and connectivity do for the world around us. So I think lots of people think about ICT as using up loads of energy, it's drives emissions, but actually it's responsible for only 1.4% of global greenhouse gases. Say only, still 1.4%. But what it can do is it has the potential to enable a 15% reduction. Now that is enormous. So if we embrace connectivity and all the benefits that come with it, actually we can have a really disproportionate impact on the world around us. And again, if I try and bring that to life for all of you, things that we get excited about, the type of projects that we're working on, how can you work in a factory? So we're working with companies to work in a virtual reality world, but from different locations, so they can work together on a manufacturing activity, such as Hyperbat, which is an electric car battery manufacturer that we work with, and they can work on the same piece in a virtual reality world, but from different locations. So without having to travel, it's much more efficient. You get the business benefit, but you also get a massive sustainability benefit as well. Secondly, if you think of some of the jobs that we do at the moment that require lots of travel, that perhaps are quite dangerous, things like driving trucks, managing cranes is another really good example. You can see a world where either they'll be autonomous or you'll be able to manage those from a control center using 5G and connectivity without actually having to travel and all the emissions that go with that. So loads and loads of opportunity. And we're starting to do that. We are working with companies to do it, but what we want to do is do more and more of it. And we think this connectivity is really at the heart of how we can transform our society moving forwards and how we can get that sustainability benefit. And I talk loads about business because actually I think 5G is about business and enterprise as importantly as consumers. So I think people often think of the consumer use cases first, and there's loads, but I think business and enterprise is really important. However, if we look at the consumer side of it, the consumers are also crying out for this connectivity. They're telling us, this is a study that we did, and they're telling us that 46% believe that future technology innovation will be crucial to solving many of those challenges that we've got. And 36% are actively kind of going, I want those devices to come and help me solve some of these challenges. So the business benefit is there, and you can see that not only can we reduce energy usage, improve our sustainability, but you can also help create, you can create a really good business case there, but the consumers are also really seeing the benefits of what they can do. So we've got that link. I guess one of the questions that I get asked is how are we doing on 5G? I get asked that all the time. And the reality is, the US and Asia are ahead. They are really powering on this. Europe is lagging behind. And one of the big calls that Ericsson has is, we really want to go faster on 5G and connectivity because that's what will enable all of this change and enable this sustainability. And we really risk missing out. Our estimates suggest that in North America and Northeast Asia, they'll be at 95% population coverage by 2027. We expect Europe to be at about 80%. So that gives you a sense of kind of how much we want to see Europe pushing on this to catch up with North America and Asia, because otherwise we risk missing out on not just the business benefits and the consumer benefits, but also really importantly on the sustainability benefits that we can get from that as well. So if I then, what would I leave you with? I would say, we're really, really keen to make sure that we get that connectivity rolled out. 5G, we can't get the benefits if we haven't got the networks, so please make sure that rolls out. We'd love to see governments really embrace 5G and connectivity across all departments and not just about the department in charge of connectivity, but actually, how can we build in sustainability targets and more efficient working across all government departments? And most importantly, my ask for all of you in the room is, how can we use this? How can we create innovation, better ways of working, and that real step change so that our connectivity will make a massive change? So thank you very much.
welcome to the stage Sophie Dembinski, Head of Policy and UK at Ecosia, Ellen Moeller, Head of Europe at Watershed, and Bloomberg's Nate Langston.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for sticking around here. We're going to have a very interesting conversation about how green is tech, really. And I'm going to break with convention of the day ever so slightly before we have a conversation, because I'd like to show you the results of a rather loud and definitive Twitter poll result, which we're going to pull up. I wanted to ask a question. Do you believe most tech companies are as green as they say they are? The answer is 93.5% no, which is a pretty definitive response, pretty loud. I do usually find it's a good experiment on social media when you need advice, is to ask what the very loudest people think you should do and then do the opposite. So on this occasion, I'd like to run the poll again with everyone in here and who's watching online, just to see if your opinion on this answer differs. So it's the same. Okay, it's a slightly different question, but it's still a yes or no answer. So if you fancy voting on this, we'll talk about it. But in the short term, Ellen and Sophie, it's great to have you here. I just wondered if first you could give us a sense of what your companies do, and then your initial reactions to the rather clear answer that our Twitter users gave us. So Ellen, we'll start with you.
Happy to. I lead the European business for Watershed, which is a technology company that helps medium and large businesses run their end-to-end climate program, everything through understanding where their emissions lie, to acting on those emissions, reducing those emissions, and then ultimately reporting and being transparent about that as well. Happy to give kind of a quick take on that, and then I'll hand it over to Sophie as well. I think I would say, maybe to the tech question, inherently tech, like many other industries, has very non-green elements of it. And it's not created equal across all tech businesses as well, I should say. There are choices within every business on how green they want to be. And I'd say transparency is really important to consumers, to stakeholders, to help them understand that. Example of that is, let's say, data centers, for example. Most tech companies have big data center footprints. There's a lot of choices they can make on whether it's on-prem or colo or in the cloud, where the grid is, and a lot of that can actually impact how green that part of their emissions are, or actually how they run their processing. So that's just one example of many, but it really depends, and I'll say it's very business to business, and we encourage a lot of transparency around that, such that as a consumer, you'd have a better sense of how to answer that question for that very reason.
Sophie, Ecosia.
Yeah, so Ecosia, lots of you might know Ecosia as a search engine that plants trees. We do quite a lot more than that at this point now, kind of 12, 13 years on down that path. And no doubt we'll kind of cover those things during this session. But I run the UK for Ecosia, and also the policy piece, which involves tech and climate policy, given that we're a search engine and we plant trees. Anyway, we'll come to that. To this question, I mean, I'm not surprised. And as Ellen was saying, I mean, essentially, every company, no matter which business you're in, which sector you're in, has a responsibility to be as green as possible. Every company has the values that the company sets. And I kind of say, you know, everyone has their cause and context, right? So if you're in the tech sector like we are, you're inherently involved in the ICT sector. We just were hearing about the carbon emissions of that sector. And therefore, we have a responsibility to engage with that responsibly, to take the right steps to mitigate the carbon from that. And we have been, and we're 200% energy renewable at this point, so we're carbon negative and have been for a long time. So we've taken that as part of the values that drive the company, kind of very seriously early on. And yeah, so I think that's important for companies to consider. But then on top of that, obviously, there's regulation that can help with that, right? That number's pretty high. I think it's 93%. So I think there's clearly a bit of a gap in terms of expectations of what employees are looking for from their employer, and what actually the employer is delivering.
Well, let's have a look at the result of our live poll. So this is a slightly less extreme answer, but it's still a pretty resounding no. You do not believe your employer or business does enough to combat to control environmental impact. So it's a very similar set of answers from both of those questions. Before we get into the nitty-gritty then, Sophie, can you just explain to me, when I'm searching on Ecosia, and I am an Ecosia user, how exactly are all my searches translating into trees going in the ground? Like, how do you do that and compete with Google, which is a pretty big...
Right. I mean, it's very hard to compete with Google. I mean, Google owns 96% of the European search market, right? So that's a tough one to crack, but we're doing pretty well. We have 20 million users across Europe and the US largely, but elsewhere too. And in terms of kind of those users, why they're using Ecosia, I mean, they fundamentally are very concerned about climate change. So in terms of competing with Google, I mean, we have a value proposition which, really speaks to people who are worried and also are looking for a way of making a difference. It's free, it's accessible. You just need internet access. So that speaks to a lot of people who are desperate to do something. And we see that number rise as, unfortunately, climate disasters increase. Unfortunately, we see people, coming to Ecosia more and more, which is good for us, but obviously it reflects a wider problem. So in terms of how Ecosia works, I mean, transparency is incredibly important for us. So if anyone, and I would encourage anyone who doesn't use Ecosia to quickly go on the App Store and download, and you can see as I'm talking what I'm talking about. But we have a large number, which now sits at over 157 million trees, which goes up as more and more users use Ecosia and click on ads. And it's an imperfect system that we built Ecosia on, right? The idea of clicking on ads and consuming, but that is the challenge of the search market space, right? So we can talk a bit more about those challenges, obviously, but Ecosia was created to basically create a scalable revenue stream so that we could contribute to reforesting the planet. So we sit upon the Bing infrastructure, and all of the money that is generated through ads goes into fighting climate change. 80% has always been signposted for reforestation projects, so we're one of the largest reforestation organizations in the world, which is great. And the remaining 20% goes into other exciting initiatives like renewables, like regenerative agriculture investments, and a few other different fun projects that we're involved in. But the idea is that we are using a business model, a search engine, and kind of putting all of that revenue into, all the profits into fighting climate change. So, yeah.
So instead of keeping the ad money is going towards planting trees.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Ellen, you come from the other side of this in terms of working with companies that have maybe not put climate and green credentials at the heart of their business, but want to, and help them figure out where those emissions are and how to offset them or get rid of them completely. Could you just talk us through a little bit about what the average process there looks like and where some of the stumbling blocks are with some of the businesses you work with?
Yeah, I'll say it starts with the data. It all comes down to data at the end. That's the kind of critical piece to understanding where your emissions lie. And so when we begin working with a business across many different types of industries, what we first do is work with them on actually ingesting that data, taking it from primary sources where we can. So we're really getting back to kind of where it's most raw and where it's most accurate. And then using that to actually identify what that means in terms of their total emissions. And so we have a climate science team internally that's all the methodology that we use. We make that methodology very transparent to our customers so they can follow along on that journey. And then it's ultimately giving them a picture of what those emissions look like and where they lie. And once you have that, that's when you can start taking action. We often find that customers come to us thinking their emissions are going to lie in one place and being quite surprised actually where there are hotspots of emissions within their business. An example of that, we work with Monzo here in the UK. They weren't thinking about payment processing as a place that actually housed a lot of their emissions as a business. But once they were able to figure that out, they were then able to do something about that. And that can look like engaging with different vendors, working with them directly to reduce those emissions or get them to get a program in place, or in some cases looking at removals as an option, or avoidance credits as well. So I think once you can follow that data, which is really where we start with businesses, that's where the action can come. And then once that's done as well, it's an ongoing basis, I should say, you can then start to report on that and produce that kind of transparency effort that we spoke about earlier. And that's interesting because in the first slide we saw, the 90-odd% of people who think companies aren't as green as they say they are, it may not be because those companies are lying. They might just be wrong.
And they actually think, well, we thought we were doing a good job, and they come to a company like Watershed, and you say, well, no, you are completely wrong, because this is where it's all coming from. Do you find that is consistently the case, that companies are completely wrong about where the problem lies?
Not always. I think we work with wonderful sustainability teams and companies who've been thinking about this for a while and have been thinking deeply about the data. But there are often surprises. And also, as a business grows, there's going to be changes in the business that are going to impact their emissions as well. So whether that be an acquisition or a new business line or a country expansion, and navigating emissions that way can be challenging unless you've got sort of support behind you and understanding grid factors and downstream supply chain elements that can actually contribute to that. So I'd say it's an ongoing effort, and that's why it can't just be a sort of look at this once a year and then get off to the races. It needs to be something that is very much integrated into the everyday practices of a business.
Now, you mentioned transparency earlier, Sophie. And one of the things that intrigued me when we were speaking ahead of this panel is you said the most popular piece of content that Ecosia publishes every month is a pretty granular breakdown of how much money you've made and where you're spending it. In a very different way to a quarterly or annual report that a public company would have to do. Why do you think that is? And what is it about the transparency there that keeps people wanting to read that?
Yeah. I mean, our users are incredibly engaged with the product. And when you were talking about the little tree counter that you get at the top, for lots of people, they really consider those to be their trees. Like, I think, if you have kind of upwards of 100, 200, whatever trees, people love to see the number go up. And they want to know where those trees are actually being planted. So storytelling and helping to bring people along with the journey is really fundamental to Ecosia. It also makes us very different to other kind of tech companies, I would say, in terms of kind of, we're very, you see a lot of the characters in terms of the people actually planting the trees, employees, etc., on the kind of content that we put out. So we're very much kind of a personable kind of company. And in terms of the monthly reports, we've been doing them really from the offset. So we really wanted to ensure that transparency was ingrained within the business model. And it is amazing to see that is consistently still, despite all the kind of the videos that we put out, all of the stuff on social media, that is the thing that people are interested in. And they're also interested to see that we, as much as our tree number goes up, it also goes down sometimes. We're really for us, the tree survival rate is one of the most important things, right? We're not just planting trees. The trees need to survive, and as the science changes as well, we are there making adjustments and making sure that it's accurate and reflective of what's happening on the ground. So we have a tree team which goes out and kind of looks at all the projects and checks check that everything on the ground is correct, and then we adjust the tree counter accordingly. So for us, integrity, transparency, knowing that things are a moving target. We're planting lots of trees, but they need to survive. We're kind of reflecting that in our storytelling. Also, it helps with accountability as well. It keeps us true to our mission, and it keeps users along with us as well. So that's probably why it's one of the most kind of read pieces for us. But yeah, users really enjoy interacting with that content and seeing where the money's going, which tree planting projects the money's going into.
Yeah, I mean, definitely with the trees, it's quite nice for me to know that the heavy metal drummers of the early 90s and the searches about them that I've made have gone some way to solving deforestation. But the other side of this is, as you say, is this accountability and this keeping the sort of the impetus up. And you must, Ellen, give companies reports or give them the tools to make reports about how they're improving or if they're improving. Yeah. Do you have conversations with them about whether or not they should be publishing those, perhaps in a similar way to Ecosia, not in a way that violates any regulatory issue they might have, but is that a conversation you have, and if so, how does that go?
Absolutely, and I would just say, to kind of to build on that, I think what you say on the engagement you see from your community, and I think this is true for companies needing to report for investors or their customers as well, that kind of engagement we're seeing only continue to increase. And we very much encourage our customers to report, to be transparent on that reporting. Now, there's kind of a lot of companies today that are starting to do this on a voluntary basis, and there are voluntary disclosure schemes that many of our customers choose to report to for that reason. And also, we see the kind of incoming policy that is going to be requiring this for many businesses as well. I think both those forces are important, and they are beneficial. And we tell our customers, report as much as possible, be as transparent as possible, be clear on the methodology, let us arm you with how we got to these numbers with you, because exactly as you say, the science year on year is going to evolve, And it's important to just be transparent on how that's impacting ultimately your business as well. And you want to be up to date with the newest methodology, and that's a lot of the role that we play with our climate science team with our customers. And so I'd say it doesn't stop at just kind of doing things internally. It also is something to engage investors, it engages employees, it engages prospective employees as well. And so it's absolutely sort of a big focus for us as we work with customers.
And how is the change, if you like, in the regulatory landscape over the last 10, 15 years affected how you talk to companies in terms of reporting? Like, has it made it easier for you to convince them to publish, knowing that maybe it'll help with, I don't know, tender proposals or whatever else?
It absolutely has, and I think there's some unification around reporting that is very helpful, right? It's difficult if everyone is reporting in a very different way, and so we are optimistic that as some of these disclosure schemes are starting to unify around certain standards, that's going to be very helpful for comparing apples to apples across companies. I think today that's still very, very challenging for the average person, really for anyone, to be able to compare across businesses. So I think that is a very helpful mechanism that is definitely coming into effect.
Okay. Sophie, tell me how long has Ecosia been around now? 12, 13 years, something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
You're doing something right, because you're competing with Google and you're still in business and you're still doing good things. What is what you've done so far allowing you to now think about doing over the next few years, next 3, 5 years?
That's a really good question. So yeah, I mean, lots of people will know us as the search engine that plants trees, but we are also many other things. We're the largest European search engine. We're the largest non-profit search engine. We also now have a climate tech VC, which has become the largest in Europe, the World Fund, which is fantastic. And so I spoke about the 80% always going into reforestation projects, which makes us one of the largest reforestation movements in the world, which is awesome. The remaining 20% has been used for a number of different things. We've got a regenerative agriculture fund, one of the largest, as you'll know, one of the largest causes of deforestation, which is incredibly important to us, right? There's no point in us planting trees when other people are kind of ripping them out with the other hand. Commercial agriculture is something we're really interested in, kind of moving the system towards regenerative agriculture. So we're doing a number of different things, and one of the other areas that we work a lot on in terms of kind of also as an ICT company looking at our own carbon footprint is the renewable sector. So we've been using solar for a long time in Germany. We've built a number of plants there, which is great. We've spent 7 million on that, which as a startup initially was quite a big investment for us. And then we have invested a further 30 million when Russia invaded Ukraine into solar energy in Germany to help to try to drive that green energy transition in Germany away from fossil fuel dependency. And also in the UK, we are now going to be announcing as well further investments in the renewable sector here. So we're looking to invest about €250,000 in the renewable sector here in the UK, which is fantastic. So we're really excited about that. And we want other companies to come along with us, right? I mean, Ecosia has planted a lot of trees and it's having a bit of an impact, which is great, but we can't do this by ourselves. Others have spoken about kind of the need to have others join and come along with us on that journey. So partnerships are really important with other organizations who feel also compelled to do something to invest in that transition. So we'd love to work with other organizations who also want to invest in renewable energy across the UK and elsewhere as well. So there's a few different projects, and we're definitely trying to fight climate change on a number of different fronts.
Well, we've had a couple of questions that came in. We've got another 5 minutes or so to talk. One of them that I can see here that I'm going to put to you: can consumerism and population growth ever be positively reconciled with environmentalism? Now that's an easy question for 4 minutes in a tech conference to answer, but can it? Yes, no.
I mean, that's a really difficult one. I mean, there's a lot of things in there. It's quite a loaded question. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, right, our business model, unfortunately, does require people to buy things, right? And then with that, we're doing something which is good for the environment. I mean, the current system needs to move away from extractive capitalism, I would say, right? We need to move towards something which is much more inclusive. We need a just transition. We need to make sure that everyone comes along with us on this journey. So fundamentally, I mean, there's a lot in there, but we need to move towards something which is much more sustainable and inclusive.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, Ellen, did you have a comment on that?
No, I think it is obviously a big question. I think that there are choices in how consumerism operates, and also I think as you're using funding to invest in technologies that are going to be critical for this transition, I think as Ecosia is doing, or as we've seen other tech companies, the likes of kind of what Stripe and others have done on investing heavily in kind of forward buying on carbon removals, that's coming from an area of actually making revenue on consumerism, but it's investing it in technologies. And so seeing more companies actually start to invest there, I think is encouraging. But the outcome of that question, I think there's a lot there and a lot remains to be seen.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to get to is to figure out how you maintain that inertia. I mean, obviously, Sophie, you mentioned that you tend to get an uptick when there have been natural disasters. People obviously concerned about environmental impact, want to do something. Ecosia is one of the choices that they make to sort of make a difference bit by bit. And Ellen, in your conversations with companies, sometimes the data show that, yes, you need to do this, this, and this. And in the first instance, it might be easy enough to get those conversations going, but how do you keep people engaged and actually wanting to continue making a difference and not just being a box-ticking exercise? Is there a lesson that you can teach us?
Yeah, happy to start there. I think the big piece on this, I think, is also helping companies frame this not just as a box-ticking exercise or even just an altruistic thing, but there actually being some real ROI, some real return on investment from investing in strong sustainability, strong climate programs. I mean, this can help with things like logistics optimization that can actually help the bottom line, or helping on kind of travel optimization that can improve the bottom line. We see investors wanting to pay premiums for companies that actually have really strong programs in this place, so it can really help with getting funding in certain cases as well. Then there's sort of this less quantifiable around employee engagement and attraction that I mentioned earlier, and so it's going to look slightly different for every business, but it is not just a box-checking exercise, and if anything, we actually see a huge amount of value coming from many of the businesses that end up engaging quite deeply here. And being able to show that data over time, I think is going to be a critical component, and that's where things like software and pulling that actually into everyday business practices, and not just sitting in a little corner of a business, is going to be really critical for that.
Sophie, how do you maintain that interest? How do you keep people coming back once they've discovered that they can use you?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's not a lack of concern around the environment, right? I mean, we're a B2C company. We go straight to the consumers. The users of the internet are concerned about the environment, and they come to us. And I mean, in some ways, it's almost the opposite. A lot of our users are kind of under the age of 40, 45, and are incredibly worried to the point that they have, climate anxiety. And we do a lot of content to try to help people through that, right? Because this is a marathon; it's not a sprint. So it's more like, how do you prevent the overwhelm, and how do you make sustainable choices which are integrated within your life, which align with your values. And for a lot of people, Ecosia is a way of doing that without making too much of a change. So I think, we almost have the kind of the opposite problem, right? How do we look after our users? How do we make sure that they're getting the information they need, and that they feel empowered, to make greener choices? So we have greener kind of products and ways that you can, when you use Ecosia, kind of differentiate between different things that you might be shopping for, etc. And also just making sure that they have the information about how to perhaps direct their climate action as well.
Well, Ellen, Sophie, it's been absolutely fascinating. We are sadly out of time, but thank you for joining us today, and thank you everybody for attending or for watching online. Thank you both.
Yeah.
Please welcome to the stage Will Hayter, Senior Director for the Digital Markets Unit at the Competition and Markets Authority, and Bloomberg's Brad Stone.
All right. Welcome, Will.
Thank you very much.
I know what they're all thinking right now. Finally, the regulator is here.
Exactly.
No, but it's so great you're here. I mean, understanding the power of big tech companies, and if necessary, addressing it, controlling it, is so important. You're the Senior Director for the Digital Markets Unit, DMU, at the Competition Market Authority, CMA. So you're an acronym nestled within an acronym.
I'm afraid so.
I think maybe we should start out by you explaining what the DMU is and what your mandate is.
Sure. I mean, perhaps just briefly on the CMA as a whole. So our job as a whole is to make markets work for consumers, businesses, and the economy. And we do that through a whole range of things: consumer law enforcement, competition law enforcement.
I mean, would the equivalent in the US be the FTC?
Somewhere between the FTC and the DOJ, or the combination.
Okay.
And so within that, the Digital Markets Unit has been set up to prepare for a new framework that the government's planning to legislate for, to consider the market power of the very most powerful firms, particularly in platform markets, and work out how to open up some of those markets to more innovation and more competition.
And I want to come back to the phrase you used, planning to legislate. But first, I was sort of curious what our audience, how much they knew about the DMU and the CMA. So we designed a live poll, so we could maybe throw that up on the screen, just sort of asking about current impressions of the CMA. Might reveal something of the political leanings. But while we wait for results, so earlier in the year, there was a statutory commitment from the government to sort of to give statutory powers to the DMU, formalizing the role, strengthening your enforcement abilities. That's still pending. So give us an update and tell us what it means that this law hasn't yet been passed.
So the government has stated in the Queen's speech in May that it plans to publish a draft bill this session of Parliament, which will create this new framework. And we're working with the government on the underlying policy and preparing to implement that when it comes in. But we're on a bit of a twin track approach, because while we're doing that, and we think that's important to be able to really tackle some of these issues most fully, meanwhile we have our existing powers, and so we're using those to the best of our ability, again, to try and tackle some of the problems we see deriving from market power in some of these sectors.
I feel like you're like a superhero without the cape right now. So what is it? What are the limits without this law being passed, and what you can do to follow through on some of the investigations you've conducted?
Yeah. So the traditional tools have been around for a long time. They were all set up essentially before digital was a thing, and they're still effective for certain things, but they are, we think, not quite sufficient to deal with some of the challenges here. And that's to do with enforcement action in particular being backward-looking, having to be quite narrowly targeted to a specific issue, it being quite difficult to design remedies that will actually be effective in the market. So what's needed is a bit of a shift to being able to set some of the rules up front frankly, in a more collaborative way with the companies concerned than is really can really work under that enforcement framework, so that we can get better results more quickly in the market, and again open those markets up to stronger competition, more innovation, create more of a level playing field for businesses other than the very biggest ones to compete fairly.
Right. Now, one aspect of the mandate is to help the CMA review mergers. And now you've warned me that you have to be careful in addressing specific cases, so let me try to be suitably oblique. Well, one thing that the CMA has and outsiders have wished for is more action on so-called killer acquisitions. These deals by big tech companies to buy smaller firms and maybe park them or kill them entirely. So I guess I wonder, do regulators have the necessary tools right now to stop these kinds of deals?
So the work of looking at mergers takes a similar approach across sectors. We are always focused on the evidence, always trying to understand what's going on, whatever industry that's in. What we said, particularly in relation to the move to digital, is that we need to be able to think harder about the prospects for future competition, and that's partly as a result of us and others around the world having looked back at past acquisitions and thought, perhaps we should have asked some tougher questions about where that might be going at the time. And so we've been doing that in these sectors.
Well, that's really interesting. So the key is looking how it impacts future competition. So not evaluating where a market is and how a deal that seems small might impact things now, but looking ahead and saying, well, can this lead to anti-competitive outcomes?
Exactly. by its nature, merger control is always forward-looking because you're saying there are two companies wanting to merge. What's the effect on competition likely to be in the future? So we always need to try and think about dynamic competition. But here, I think in particular, we're trying to think about what this might mean for innovation in the future in these markets, whereas we know innovation is so critical.
Wait, so now let me have a go at one specific case. So you guys had some success with the Facebook Giphy acquisition. You largely won in court on most of the counts, although it was remanded to you for one individual count. The CMA has also, I think, had some success with the gene editing companies Grail and Illumina. And so I guess I wonder, is there anything of a turning point here in the UK or in Europe in general in stopping these kinds of deals between big companies that could potentially squash competition?
I mean, I'd hesitate to describe some sweeping trend. Again, we go through a clearly set out process on any merger we look at. We have this two-stage process where we do an initial investigation, where we have to work out if there is a realistic prospect of a reduction in competition. Subject to that, we can then take it to a second stage, where we have to work out whether it's more likely than not that there'll be a reduction in competition. And at that second stage, an independent panel is appointed. It's nothing to do with the CMA board or the CMA staff, and they have to take the decision. So that's what happened on the Meta Giphy acquisition.
And Microsoft Activision.
That's now gone to that second stage as well. So as I said, it's an independent, evidence-driven process. Those points I described about future competition, innovation, those are, if you like, about the questions we try to ask ourselves as we go through the work, but it always has to come back to the evidence.
Well, let me ask it this way on Microsoft Activision. I mean, that's the biggest deal in Microsoft history. I believe it's the biggest deal in the history of the video game industry. Is it getting a more vigorous review right now in the UK than it would have gotten before the DMU was formed, maybe 5 years ago in a different regulatory climate?
Well, 5 years ago would have been rather different anyway, because this deal, like any big global deal, would have resided, responsibility for that would have resided in Brussels. So now we have to think about that in London too. I mean, it's a really big acquisition. It's hard to think that 5 years ago, before the EMU, that we would have just somehow glossed over it. It still looks like a big, significant deal. I think almost whatever lens you put on the market. But I mean, just to underline, there are other deals in tech, for example, Facebook Customer at the time and Microsoft Nuance that we looked at and then cleared. And indeed, Norton Avast, we looked at phase 1, thought there would be a problem, came to phase 2, and actually we switched the decision and cleared it.
Okay. Well, let me take a step back. So the DMU has conducted some 10 investigations looking into mobile platforms, online advertising, Amazon. When you kind of consider the body of this work and step back, what conclusions can you draw about the state, the health of competition in the UK when it comes to tech? Are tech markets healthy in the UK right now?
So I think that's probably too big a question to answer simply, as you know, but we certainly worry about tendencies towards market power and the prospects for that market power being competed away, if you like, naturally. And so that's what lies behind what we think is the need for a new approach. The idea being that we would need to pass, it would be a very high bar, but we would be saying there are certain companies in particular markets that have such an entrenched position of market power that they need essentially an element of special treatment. And without that, we're in this position where we can go in with specific cases here and there, but it can be difficult to really go after the real underlying source of the market power. But it all comes down to the specifics. And I would say, if we had to describe a sort of USP for ourselves among authorities like us, it's really on really understanding the business models and really doing the work to understand the market in the round, try to work out what's going on, what the risks might be, also what the many benefits are from these markets.
Yeah.
So we've done that in most depth on digital advertising, so particularly Google, thinking about Google in search and Facebook and social media, and we've just completed the study on the mobile sector, and so there we can really build what we think is a really good understanding of those markets and then work out what might be the right action to take.
Well, let me ask about that, because this is an incredibly concentrated market, 2 major players, complete consolidation, lots of gatekeeping power in terms of what apps make it onto our phones and what don't. They take a toll of every piece of commercial revenue that passes through our phones. So you've conducted, one of the most in-depth studies of that market. What does intervention or remedy look like?
Yeah, so exactly. We, as you say, we've just spent 800 pages essentially explaining what you've just summarized. And
what does the last page say? Summarize it.
So the answer to that is we've got a set of things which we are either doing already or considering doing immediately with our current powers. So those are, we have 2 competition cases in relation to Google and Apple's in-app requirement to use their own in-app payments services. We have consulted on a market investigation specifically into web browser restrictions and cloud gaming, which are all about the worry that the rules that those gatekeepers are setting are essentially shutting off competition from smaller firms. So, for example, the web developer who might want to develop a sophisticated web app and can't get that to the iPhone because of the way that the browser software is configured. So these are the precise remedies are quite specific, and we've got a list, if you like, of sort of 10 to 15 concerns across those 2 mobile ecosystems, and the approaches needed for each one have to be quite specific as well.
Right. Now, Apple has its reasons for exerting such control over the iOS ecosystem, right? It wants to preserve order on the ecosystem. It doesn't want third parties to create redundant stores beyond its own payment mechanism. Has it been receptive to your suggestions? And do you find its justifications for exerting control over the iPhone ecosystem to be disingenuous or self-serving?
So that is exactly the job, answering those questions is exactly the job of these kinds of investigations. So on the payments ones, those are in flight, so depends on what we find through the course of those. On the browsers thing, for example, we have had lots of engagement, as you might imagine, from Apple, and a lot of that is about the importance of privacy and security for users, which, as a general principle, we
support that.
We wouldn't.
Sounds good.
It's hard to dispute that. But the question that we are, so if you like, working out whether to ask ourselves through this proposed investigation is whether those arguments, if you like, whether they stack up, whether it's really necessary to put such rigid controls as we see in place in order to achieve those benefits, or whether it's possible to achieve the benefits while actually still allowing somewhat greater competition.
Right. I mean, these are exactly the right questions, but it just strikes me that we've been asking them for a long time, and not the DMU, but in the US, for example, the investigation of online ad networks has been ongoing in the US forever. And as someone who writes about big tech and is somewhat sensitive to the concerns of smaller players who complain about the big tech companies, I just wonder, why does it take so long? What about the process here, I don't know, the political process or the regulatory process, is drawing out what appears to be a consensus about resolving consolidation in tech?
Yeah, so the processes in the US are different to the ones here, and it's more litigation-driven through the courts, and so that has its own requirements. One does need to take a decent amount of time to, as I said, to really think through and understand these issues. But I think you can. I mean, there are some well-known, if you like, case studies of how difficult it is to really get to useful results through the traditional enforcement tools. Probably the most obvious one that's often quoted is Google Shopping in Europe, where the complaint was back in 2011, and that's sort of still rumbling on. And I don't think anyone in that case, and I don't think
it's still alive.
I'm not sort of casting aspersions on anyone. I just think it's fairly obvious to say that
they didn't think it would take a decade.
Well, the complainant probably isn't that happy. Other participants in the market probably aren't that happy. Consumer bodies probably aren't that happy, and I'm pretty sure Google might not be happy either, just because it's a very long, drawn-out process and a very difficult.
No, I remember the plaintiffs aren't even around in it. Those companies don't exist, as far as I know.
Yeah, it takes a long time. Again, things can move very fast in these markets. hence the need for a structure that's able to move faster with that if you're really able to make any useful headway.
Right. Well, one of the investigations that you've conducted that I'm the most interested in is the Amazon one. And you've been, I think since the summer, talking to sellers in the UK about the Amazon platform. What can you tell us about, what you've heard and Amazon's response? Is it too early to give us a little determination as to whether there might be some anti-competitive effects in the way Amazon administers its marketplace?
I'm afraid it is too early.
Darn, okay. Okay,
that.
well, what can you tell us about that case?
That it started and that we're gathering evidence, talking to all the people you'd expect us to be talking to. And again, we need to let that run its course to really work out what's going on. Those investigations have a clear set of processes by which you have to get the information in and consult carefully on any outcomes.
I mean, these big tech companies, with tears streaming down their faces, hold up the small and medium-sized business as their constituency, and the way in which they help them is so important to them. And yet, here are cases examining whether it's a double-edged sword, right? Whether the big platforms actually hurt as much as help sellers. I guess I'm wondering, is it, let me just turn it around. Is there something legitimate in the way in which these few powerful tech platforms allow small businesses, and in the case of Amazon, sellers, to scale instantly and to build strong businesses?
So I'll talk in generalities rather than about Amazon, but yes, absolutely. There are big benefits from these markets. We absolutely don't dispute that, and for precisely those reasons. I mean, not just access to a large market, maybe even global in some cases, but entire new business models that didn't exist however long ago, and that's wonderful. But if power builds to the extent that those companies are almost impossible to dislodge, then that can result in problems both if you're a competitor to those companies directly, or if you're a firm that relies on that as a platform on which to do business. And so we think that we need to make sure that the terms of those platforms are offering are reasonable, and that they aren't shutting down routes to potential competition, which again are some of the issues that we've been looking at in the mobile space, where we're concerned that, for example, on the browsers piece, those restrictions put in place by Apple, we think look as if they are likely to cut off routes to competitors to Apple's benefit. But again, to be determined through the full process of these investigations.
Interesting. So we're running out of time, so let me hit a few more quick issues. In the US, we've seen antitrust bills, seemingly bipartisan support, emerge from committee, ready to go, completely founder under the weight of acrimony among politicians. What have you learned about using the legislative process to address some of these competitive issues? Is it futile considering the climate today? Maybe different in the UK than the US?
So I find the US much more mysterious, more familiar with the UK, obviously. I mean, we are independent from government, so what happens in legislation is not our job. Essentially, that's for the government to work out. We are here to do the job that we get given through statute. We have a certain job at the moment. As I said, the expectation is that that job will get added to through this new framework. We think it's quite important, as I said, to create some sharper tools, if you like, to be able to tackle some of these issues more quickly and more effectively. And yes, that does, in this instance, require legislation.
You're not an expert on US politics. I am not an expert on UK politics, but I'm led to believe that you have a new boss now, a new prime minister, who, as far as I can tell, is maybe more likely than her predecessor to be a pro-free market, anti-regulation. Do you have any idea how the administration of Liz Truss might affect the work of the CMA?
Generally speaking, no. As I said, we're independent from government and we are carefully apolitical. And as I said, we'll do the job we're given through Parliament. I mean, all I would say, when you talk about free markets and regulation, one thing that's important to keep in mind, I think, is that what we're talking about in this DMU framework is not, red tape regulation across thousands of companies. We're talking about a handful of companies at most, where there is that very specific entrenched market power. And actually, if you're someone that really worries about free markets, I would argue that right now these markets are not free because they are at the behest of these big platforms in many cases. So what I think we can all agree probably we want is for competition to be effective and people to be able to have a fair crack of the whip. And when you've got this huge entrenched market power, there's a risk that that can't happen.
Well, when you make that case to the new Prime Minister, we look forward to hearing how it goes. Thank you, Will Hader.
Thanks very much, Brad.
Please welcome to the stage Howard Boville, Head of Cloud Platform at IBM, Windows Snyder, Founder and CEO of Thistle Technologies, Renaud File, Founder and CEO of Synhactive, and Morten Kjaersgaard, CEO of Heimdal Security, with Bloomberg's Jordan Robertson.
Thanks, everybody, for being here today. We've got some great guests on this panel about cybersecurity. Just to introduce kind of the topic a little bit, here at Bloomberg, we've done a lot of reporting over the last few years about supply chain security, supply chain cybersecurity. And on stage with us, we have some of the world's experts in certain aspects of this topic. So what we wanted to talk about today was specifically software supply chain security. Now, you might see some statistics we'll throw on the board about how cybersecurity spending is as high as it's ever been. It's growing at a really fast rate. It's one of the fastest growing areas of technology. But one of the things we've learned through our reporting is that there's an area of cybersecurity, which is supply chain security, which is one of the hardest problems to solve. And we have on stage with us folks who are trying to solve that really hard problem. So I think we'll kick it off with Window. So Window is a former senior security officer with some of the biggest tech names that we've all heard of, Apple and Microsoft and Intel and Mozilla and others. Window, you and I were talking earlier about how the security landscape has changed in the last 20 years since you've been kind of in the industry, and a really big problem as you see it now that you're trying to start with Thistle Technologies. Why don't you give the audience a sense of the arc of that, the evolution of software development, and specifically secure software development, where we were at then, where we're at now, and then we kind of open up the panel.
Absolutely. I honestly feel like I've been trying to solve the same security problem for decades, like almost my entire career. And early on, we saw, let's say, when in the early aughts, when Microsoft was having a lot of problems with malware and viruses, that one of the things I did in my role there was bring a lot of security mitigations into the platform that would mitigate broad categories of vulnerability. And those were already present in other OSs like OpenBSD and Linux. But what we saw was that there were general purpose operating systems that over the course of 20 years built a degree of security resilience that was more and more robust. And this is true for phone OSs as well. But in my work at Intel as the Chief Software Security Officer, in my roles with device security companies, I was exposed to these lower level technologies, and I started to realize that they didn't have the degree of security resilience that I had come to expect from general purpose operating systems. The work that we've been doing for decades in these larger platforms, very little of it was actually being scaled down or made available to device manufacturers. And so we see things like a lack of separation of privilege. We see a real dearth of the security protections that we see from these general purpose operating systems. So the problem that we're trying to solve at Thistle Technologies is the fact that for the development environments that are trying to build these security mechanisms into these devices, they end up reinventing the wheel in all these different places, and to two different degrees of security resilience, which is inappropriate for the threats that they're up against today, and really insufficient for the kinds of threats they're going to be faced with over the course of their lifespan, because these devices persist in place for 10, 20 years, even more. If it's a car, it's going to be on the road for probably 20 plus years. If it's in industrial manufacturing, that component could be in place for decades as well. So really seeing that we're not going to be able to catch up. We don't have 20 years to catch up against the threats that we're dealing with today, let alone what we need to be resilient against for the future. So what I'm doing is taking the security work that we've done for general purpose operating systems and making it available to software developers who are working on these devices so they don't have to reinvent the wheel in every different development environment, and they can kind of leapfrog into a modern security posture by incorporating these kinds of technologies into their product.
You'd mentioned it's kind of like what's interesting to me is it's kind of like going back to the future in some ways, which is the phones that we use, the laptops we use, they're all much more secure now than they were, let's say, 20 years ago. But now we have these really powerful computers coming onto networks, whether they're smartwatch, whether they are industrial machine, whether it's a surgical robot, that are essentially kind of at the level of security that our operating systems were 20 years ago. And I wanted to go to Renault. So Renault is founder and CEO of a company called Synactive, which is a French offensive security company. So his job, and he can explain it better than I can, is companies hire his firm to hack into their devices, to look for security vulnerabilities. And Renault and I were having a conversation earlier where sometimes they will go in to a device and they will hack the device and they'll look for vulnerabilities to fix them. And the number of times that you'll go in and the software that's in there is almost exclusively not made by that vendor. Can you talk about this 1% and 99% issue? Because this gets us to this issue of supply chain security. Open source software, which everybody uses, I think it's used a lot more than we might expect, and Renault has some good statistics about what does that look like when you're ripping apart these devices, you're hacking them to figure out the vulnerabilities. How much of it actually comes from places that are not from the actual device maker?
Yes, thank you, Jordan. So the job of my company is actually to assess the cybersecurity of networks and systems. And so we are in a quite unique position to actually look under the hood and to understand actually how it is built and what is in there, and on which systems and libraries and software and frameworks it relies. And what we have noticed over the last 20 years is that, of course, the technology, the IT system have become more and more complex. It may look obvious, but probably many people have missed that because the user interface and the configuration panels are getting easier and easier. All the complexity is actually being hidden from the user, and from the user perspective, everything is getting easier, but under the hood, it's actually getting more and more complex. So now everyone is just building on top of layers and layers of frameworks, proprietary or open source softwares. Sometimes you don't even know where it comes from anymore. The open source project is quite abandoned, but it's still used somewhere. And it happens more and more often than the customer is actually asking us to review the security of its product. And when you look at this code base, you may have maybe 1% of the code base which is actually written by the customers, and 99% is in a way supply chain. It's a library, it's code written by someone else. And of course, it's very difficult for them to ensure that these 99% are secure. It is their responsibility, but it gets quite complex to understand the code written by someone else and to actually make sure it's secure. Of course, don't get me wrong, it's still the responsibility and the main focus to focus on the 1% that you're actually doing, because most of the time the 99% are more secure than the code you are just creating. But in a world where the attackers are getting more and more skilled, their playground, it's not your 1%, it's the 100% of your code and the 99% of code and system and everything you're using that you haven't built yourself, which is part of your supply chain. And today, it's actually where we find a lot of the vulnerabilities that we use to compromise the security of the system of our customers. And a very recent example, my team actually took part in a competition which is called Pwn to Own, which is organized every year. And we succeed to hack the Tesla car via the Wi-Fi mechanism, the Wi-Fi connection. I can't talk too much about the details of the vulnerability, but it will be released actually in October during a security conference. And the vulnerability was actually located in a Wi-Fi monitoring open source library written by Intel. And I'm pretty sure that the Tesla security team, which is quite good, had a look at these devices, had a look at the code, but still it wasn't in their code, the vulnerability. It was actually in the providers, in the supply chain, open source system they are using.
And no, it's great. And they actually won that competition, which is a very famous hacking competition called Pwn to Own. And Howard, so before Howard was at IBM, he was Chief Technology Officer for Bank of America. And another aspect of this problem that we discussed earlier, which is you were describing to me, and I'm hoping you can relay this to the audience, the number of small fintech companies that will be involved in what would otherwise be an ordinary transaction online, like transferring money from a bank to a bank. You click a button, you expect it to go through. What's happening behind the scenes to get to this idea of software supply chain insecurity, and Howard can speak to this, is you'll have dozens and dozens of tiny companies running small checks on that transaction. Let's call it anti-money laundering. Let's call it verification of credit scores, things like that. So why don't you talk a little bit about the complexity of a very simple transaction like transferring money and how many potential points of failure there are within that software supply chain, because it's a lot of them.
And what I would absolutely say is this is not related to Bank of America Merrill Lynch. This is kind of a general observation as to what's happening with software. So as Renault's mentioned, 99% of code base actually is taken from libraries of open source and embedded into the functions that you're doing, because many business processes are very similar, so therefore why write new lines of code? But increasingly, as IT professionals within organizations, as you think about your business process transformation, you're no longer in the business of having hordes of developers write lines of code that then you have to maintain. You will embed small software companies. If it's in financial services, it will be fintechs, but there's many other similar types of companies that orbit around other industries to service that. So if you then think about a business process like account opening, credit scores, and so on and so forth, your ecosystem of third parties is very, very large. Now, in a digital context, it's sometimes difficult to conceptualize that, but a good analogy would be to simply think of a machine with a series of cogs. And if one of those cogs is corrupted, no matter how small, it can actually corrupt the whole business process and cause problems. Now, at times that can happen because when you run IT environments, there are three golden laws of IT environments, which is hardware will fail, software will have bugs within it, and technicians will press keys that you rather they didn't. But there's also a fourth dimension, which is then when a bad actor causes an issue with that component. And as Windo mentioned, this has been a theme that's been around for some time, but with the advent of a thing called software as a service, which is probably around 10 years old in terms of gathering ahead of steam, and in that context, think of companies like Salesforce and so on, you have software that is piped to you as a company, and you consume it through a screen. But what you don't have is the same degree of controls in terms of how that software is written and the platforms on which it runs. And this is the notion of third and fourth party risk. There was a recent discussion document distributed by the Treasury in the United Kingdom on this piece and papers by other regulators around the world. Third party being the software vendor that's delivering capability to you, and fourth party being the infrastructure on which it sits, which very often can be opaque to the consumer of that. And that's different from the old model where you would buy software, you would install it into your data centers, and it would have the control frameworks to ensure that you felt comfortable that you're in the right level of adherence. So we've moved to a situation where we've got a very fragmented supply chain and more opacity. It's more difficult to actually peer into these environments to understand where your risk is. But the important point within this is to not go too far on the risk side. It's important to also understand how you can continue to embrace innovation, but be very eyes wide open, because the issue with risk is, as a species, we will suffer more in our imaginations than we will in reality, and therefore we can come up with a lot more demons that exist than do exist in reality. But the issue is that if a cybersecurity issue arises, then it can be a catastrophic event to any enterprise or actual industry. So getting that balance right in terms of the controls and the actual innovation is really important. And that's what led me from financial services to IBM, because we had built a platform that has those controls built in from the outset. We could see these issues around third and fourth party risk before white papers were being written and so on. And we feel it's the obligation of the platform owner to take those risks away. And to the previous speaker, Will Hater, to then create environments that small companies that couldn't actually manage it themselves be able to actually prosper in these marketplaces as opposed to actually diminish.
And one of the things that can happen, to Howard's point, is if one of those software as a service providers, let's say, gets ransomware and their network goes down, and you depend on them to do something like anti-money laundering checks on a transaction, to use that example, you have to have something in place. Like, that becomes a risk to your business, and that is absolutely a supply chain risk, because now what do? You need this function. Maybe that stops working. Maybe it's credit reports or credit scores on home mortgage applications. Say that those scores stop coming in because the home mortgage provider gets ransomware. And like in Renault's example, if you're able to hack into a Tesla's infotainment system through a Bluetooth vulnerability or a Wi-Fi vulnerability, there are a lot of bad things you can do to the car. So all of these are examples of kind of supply chain risks, and in interesting ways that these risks can present themselves beyond kind of typical IT risk. And so Morten is head of a Danish security company called Heimdal Security, cybersecurity software, endpoint security software. And one of the things, Morten, I was hoping you could talk about is one of the hardest areas of supply chain to manage is software updates. And Window can certainly speak to this as well, because her technology addresses this too. You expect that the update that's coming from a legitimate source is itself legitimate. How much work would you reasonably expect a customer to do to inspect it and pull it apart to see, as in the case of SolarWinds, the attack from last year, where a legitimate technology company's update mechanism was compromised and malware was inserted in it? How much work should you actually be expected to do to see if there's malware in there? Can you talk a little bit about the scanning of updates? Your technology does a little bit of this, and kind of what is considered reasonable in terms of opening an update, letting it run to see if it does something bad. You can't do that for very long, otherwise your customers will revolt. What's considered reasonable to inspect an update and see if there's something bad happening in there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jordan, and thank you for the intro. I think Renault introduced a really interesting topic before as well. But you talk about embedded trust. Yeah. So with that, you're flagging out there, and we can make a very nascent example in here. I see lots of people on the laptops or mobile phones, and you trust the updates automatically coming there. So your iOS device will get automatically updated, so you have embedded trust that Apple is doing it correctly. But if they're not, you have a serious problem. So to Jordan's point of what we do, it's not an advertisement, but we do check and those embedded updates coming out as well to customers, that they are coherent and safe. And the way we work with that is also we try to teach the customer on how to do it too. So if you're a customer or you're working in these supply chains, just like Renault and Howard also flagged out, you need to audit your vendors. You need to go to, in this case, example, Microsoft or Apple, and check, do they have kind of compliance certificates? Are they ISAE 3000 certified? Are they ISO 27001 certified? So when you choose your vendors, you make sure you do that audit and compliance process correctly. And I think to Renault's point, that's an excellent example of the kind of when you do the hacking in the process, there's always loads of this stuff. I mean, what we see when we unpack some of these softwares coming out, we had the CC Cleaner. I think people in here, some people in here might remember the CC Cleaner example from a couple of years back, and SolarWinds as you flush out. It's a supply chain breach, and the way we check that is, we go in, we actually check what is happening in there. We leave it in the box for 3 to 4 hours just to make sure that there's...
Open it up, you let it run to see if it does
Exactly,
something
yeah,
bad,
exactly. But you can't expect customers to do that. It's way beyond, I mean, anybody in here managing a Windows environment, I see some nodding down there. It's way beyond that. You'll have, for a 1,000-seat business, you'll have hundreds of updates coming through a month just on the Windows platform, and then for maybe third-party software, you'll have Adobe, Apple. There's loads of vendors you need to check. It's way beyond your grasp.
As we talked about before, there are, after the SolarWinds incident happened, which was a hacking attack last year, was a supply chain compromise. We had discussions with experts about, let's say you want to unpack a software update and let it run to see if it does something bad. What's the limitation on that? Because you have to kind of wait out the hacker's bad activity. And we were talking about, like, you might be able to look at an update for a few hours before you have to push that to your customers. It's not a lot of time. That's still a lot of, there's a lot of room in there. If you wait, let's say 5 or 6 hours, if you're the hacker, you can still get bad stuff through. I mean, Window, from your perspective, you guys are working on technology also that looks to secure the software update mechanism. One of the hardest things I have to get my head around is, again, this idea of if a software update comes from the place I'm expecting it to, and it's signed, it's cryptographically signed by the place I'm expecting it to come from, how do we prevent malware from being inserted into that? Like, at some point, customers are just going to say, I have to just click the update because, like, I've done all the checks I'm supposed to. What's your view? How do you think we should approach thinking about that problem?
You have to design your infrastructure and your devices with the expectation that there is going to be compromise. And so, if a attacker inserts malware into an update process and it's legitimately signed in a way that the device recognizes as coming from the appropriate source, then that device is going to be compromised. But the real question is, what does it mean for the rest of your organization? Is this installed on every single device in the organization? And and for the types of the devices, do they have access to everything? Do they have access to a limited reign in your infrastructure? What kind of data does it compromise? Are you able to figure that out quickly? Are you able to get back to a known good state quickly? Right? You have to design all of your mechanisms with the expectation that any one of them can be compromised. And so compartmentalization and high confidence segregation are strategies that have worked in security context from the very beginning. And these are the kinds of mechanisms that you can actually develop a high degree of confidence in. Additionally, knowing that you have a plan in place for how to evaluate the full extent of a compromise, for having a plan in place in terms of how to communicate it to the people who are impacted, whether that's your customers, your partners, your employees, the folks whose personal data you may be holding, and I hope you're holding less of it today than you were maybe a few years ago, knowing that compromise is a real possibility for your infrastructure, and that if you have less data, then you have less exposure in terms of the work that you were supposed to be a custodian of. So all of these strategies help you respond better when you expect the worst case scenario. The growing complexity is something that we can't easily constrain. So if you are accepting that we're going to incorporate more technologies into our environment, and those technologies are going to come with a bunch of technologies along with them, and the supply chain is going to be very difficult to fully understand in your environment, then you have to operate with the expectation that any one of those components can fail. What does it mean for the rest of the infrastructure? And design everything that you're building, systems, networks, applications, data stores, all of them with the expectation that there is a component in there that may be compromised, and it should not be it should not mean that everything in your environment goes along for the ride.
And Howard, you were mentioning this earlier in our conversation as well. Like, what is kind of considered best practice for? You've got a large customer, they come to you and they describe the problem we talked about before. You've got 50 organizations feeding data into a process. Let's use a bank process, for example. One of them gets ransomware. They can no longer transmit that data. They can no longer receive data. And ransomware, of course, is one of the biggest problems now in security. What's considered best practice for mitigating that supply chain problem? Do you stop processing the transaction, or?
So there's a number of things. First and foremost, you kind of got to go back to kind of all principles of good architecture. So you need to be clear in terms of the business processes that you're architecting for, and then the components associated with that. If you take these third parties as the components, and say, just choose any number. Say there's 10 different third parties in a process that you have. You then got to do a risk posture assessment on how you're going to protect against what their component is. Because in certain areas it may not be a high risk, other areas it may be very high risk. So you put then the controls around that the panelists have talked about here. But you've also got to plan for the worst as well. So what happens in the event that there is a catastrophic failure with a release where it's got malware in, or equally, I've experienced situations where vendors have given me software releases that have had bugs in that have actually caused catastrophic failures. You then have to have a plan in terms of how you actually run that process in the knowledge that you've lost that critical component. And it may be a cold environment that you bring up because actually you wanted to ensure that you've got what's known as immutable storage. That storage couldn't have been compromised by any malware insertion. You've got to keep last known good copies of your data, which is the fuel for any business process. So you have to kind of plan for the worst, but plan for the worst in not a way that you can't execute, or a way that you can execute. In certain industries, that is absolutely obligated upon you. In financial services, there is an obligation, irrespective of the regulatory jurisdiction that you operate within, that you can demonstrably operate in the event of a catastrophic failure, Because if there's an issue in terms of supply chain and financial services, it will introduce systemic risk into the financial system. And if we've learned many things through the virus, the real virus of COVID, and the current circumstances we find ourselves in, is that supply chain issues massively impact the global economy. We live in an inflationary situation now, not because of demand side issues, but because of supply side issues, supply chain issues, as it related to the world getting back to delivering goods and services, and then the geopolitical issues associated with energy. And the same applies to your own environment. And therefore, you have to kind of work through what happens when things go wrong, and how can you run your business thereafter.
Yeah, Morten?
Yeah, I just really wanted to jump in there because I might get completely under fire here by both Howard and the rest of the panel. But I'm just thinking it's very reactive in my view. If you take the Russia example, Russia-Ukraine, would we have been in this situation had there been forces in Ukraine before they were invaded? So I'm just trying to turn it around saying, should you work more proactively against it? But yes, I agree, you need to have a fallback plan, absolutely. I'm not hearing a lot of proactive measure going into.
Sorry, without doubt, you have to put all of the controls, the architectural controls, based upon the risk posture that I talked about, to prevent something from happening. But you also have to put the same degree of diligence and rigor into something happening, because there are far more black swans than anybody imagines that happens in life, having experienced many of those. So absolutely all of the controls around zero trust, workplace, workforce, and actually a workload, or hardware, if it's hardware you're working through. But also you have to have plans that are executable should something go wrong.
Yeah, because I'm really thinking, what actually kickstarted for me was the point about the data. And the data volume I see is actually exponentially increasing. It's not declining. So there's just getting more and more data, transactions are accelerating, and the control you can put in place is kind of getting undermined a little bit by the speed of which things are moving, in my point.
You then take different risk postures with data. So certain data you'll encrypt at rest, in use, and also in transit. And then it opens up another topic for perhaps a different panel. You've got to think about post-quantum encryption. The US federal government has just issued, or is moving FedRAMP into law, which is a control around that, but is also obligating all federal agencies to be post-quantum encrypted relative to the 4 standards that NIST has just approved. So there's evidence that actually there is a very real and present danger now.
Along with better encryption, we also need to consider deletion. Deletion is incredibly inexpensive compared to re-architecting how you want to store your data. But at the point in time where you are creating a mechanism to decide what data to collect, you should also be designing a mechanism that decides when to delete it. That there's a business case for why we're collecting this data. When that business case is satisfied, we get rid of that data, or we abstract it so that it's no longer as potentially risky if it's exposed. Do we need to know that this happened at 3:21 and 33 seconds on this date, or is it sufficient to know that it happened and it's part of a monthly profile? There's ways to reduce granularity, so when the information is compromised, it's less of an exposure. So in addition to all this other work, we also need to be more intentional about how we collect the data, that we're collecting for a specific business purpose, that when the business purpose is satisfied, that we delete it, and the mechanism for deleting it is created at the same time as the mechanism for collecting it.
And one of the other,
I strongly advise for your suggestion to delete data. It's probably one of the best security mechanism ever. And to add on what you were saying, Howard, I think that with everyone outsourcing its IT everywhere, sometimes I feel like some good principle of security, IT security architecture are being forgotten.
They're mentally outsourced.
Yeah. But the problem is that actually you have a trade-off between availability and confidentiality when you try to architecture your data. If you want to make sure your data are available, you need to put them at several places. So that, for example, if you have 3 providers, you need the 3 providers to fail at the same time in order to lose access to your system. The problem is that if you want to protect the confidentiality of your data, you just need one provider to fail to actually have your data leaked. So that's one of the few examples where confidentiality and availability can be a hard choice for management.
Just if the world wasn't complicated enough, the policies that are coming through around data sovereignty as well. So there's a lot of legislation that's going through around the world, which requires data on the first tier to be processed in the nation state. Secondly, the employees to be from the nation state. And then the third element, which takes it into the political domain, is that it is a legal entity owned by the nation state for that data to be there. The reason for mentioning that is, as you think through the logic of the different logic gates you have to go through, there's more and more logic you have to think through. And there are good reasons why these policies are being put in place. But the solutions, if you built it purely from a technical perspective, you could find in 12 months' time, you have regulatory issues that you're going to face. And this isn't just for regulated industries, it's for all industries consuming from different providers. So there are another considerations to put into any of the architectures you're putting together.
One of the other things I was hoping the panel could address is, any of you followed cybersecurity news, in the recent months, you've seen that there have been a wave of attacks against really big tech companies, Twitter and others, where they've been compromised through what's essentially a very basic mechanism, is often really young kids calling customer support and convincing a customer support agent, some of which are very highly trained to not fall for fraud, to allow them access to a network. They leak data. There's a couple of cases here in the UK where that's happened. So anybody can jump in on this, but how should we understand how some of the richest, most best protected tech companies on the planet can continually get compromised? We've talked about very kind of sophisticated supply chain and really kind of high-level stuff here. But what we've seen in the news in like the last 6 months, and we actually got a chance to listen to one of these phone calls for some of our reporting, and it's like, the woman who was targeted was really smart. She was a customer service rep. She was very well trained. She tried to deflect this guy's questions, but his question was, hey, I'm from the IT organization. We understand you have a problem with your VPN. We've got to fix your problem with the VPN. We've got to log you into the site. She was smart. She said, no, like, I don't have a problem. Eventually, to get this guy off the phone, she's fine. I'll log into the VPN. I'll show you there's no problem. And that was the hack. How should we make sense of the fact that more money is being spent on cyber than ever before, but yet some of the biggest hacks to make the news involve what is essentially kind of a human factor and teenagers?
Yeah, but that is really rights control that you need to impose there. So you need rights management internally, and how can people expose passwords, and then how often do you rotate passwords, and what kind of controls you have in place to spot password breaches and abuse of passwords in other locations than just inside the business. So to this example, to make it very concrete for the audience, I mean, if somebody leverages your password in a non-working location, IT can also typically see that if they have the controls in place. So that's a good way to make it very tangible. But I agree. Regardless of the enormous amount of spend, how can you then trust that they actually do it correctly? Yeah? That's a very different, hard topic to answer, I would say.
But there is a fundamental problem, is that the attacker have the edge, they have the advantage. By advantage, I mean that it's much cheaper to attack a company than it is to protect them. To protect it, actually, it doesn't take a big budget to actually compromise and attack a company. It takes a large budget to actually try to protect and fix every vulnerability. And that's a very boring issue. And we have seen in the recent time, for example, ransomware gangs. Now, some of them, it's about 50, 100 people. So it's still quite a good team, sometimes much bigger than the IT crew of a standard company. So it's very boring, and so we are now asking people which are in a difficult situation to actually put even more budget to protect them against attacker who keeps on putting themselves more budget and people to attack them. It's not a good situation to be in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically a marketing machine you're up against. Yeah, but it is.
There's a set business model for threat actors around this, where they will get a smaller group that will give the sophisticated attack software, other groups that are lower in the hierarchy, 100 people, 200 people that will do the threat. And to give you an idea as to kind of how kind of indiscriminate it is, very often when a hacker breaks into a computer, they don't even know which company they've got into. They then actually get lateral movement and try and extract some data to figure out where they are. Once they've figured out which company they've hacked into, they then know who they can send the ransom note to and get the Bitcoin transfer. So it is a business entity, it's a business machine to actually do this, to extract ransomware from companies, and it's operating at that scale because of the monies that can be retrieved. So the key elements, in addition to when things go wrong, is how you prevent as well. And the human dimension is always a key threat because the basic human need is the help. And if somebody's asking for help, you lean into that. So it's how you train people. And the point that Window mentioned is really important, is how you actually segment your environment so that if there is a point of insertion, that insertion is only in a small enclave as opposed to across the entire environment.
Yeah, like the LastPass hack. Where luckily they didn't get the password, but it's a good example that if you kind of narrow down the environment, you can at least control the damage limitation. Yeah.
One last topic I wanted to address before we run out of time, and again, anybody can kind of jump in. We've talked a lot about how much money is being spent on cybersecurity. It's good for everybody on this panel that that number is very, very high right now and only growing. But also what we've talked about is like there's some really big problems that are hard to fix, that are just starting to be fixed. Supply chain is kind of one of them. Anybody can jump in, but where do you think we're at on the arc of becoming more cyber secure? Like we've talked about, we've kind of reverted back to where we began with some of these IoT devices. In other areas, we've done a lot better, and laptops are more secure, phones are more secure. What's the takeaway? Like, are we in the middle of this game? Are we kind of starting all over again? It's
Personally, I think the number of problems are evolving faster than the spend is, and the number of solutions. That's just my take. I don't know.
It's not an arc, because that presumes that actually
it continues.
Never raising bar.
Okay.
So you get ahead, and then super smart people get a bit ahead of you, and then you get ahead. The good thing about cybersecurity, however, as a business, is a community. Everyone collaborates because everyone wants to keep the bad guys out. So there's a sharing of intelligence, which everyone should take a lot of confidence from in terms of sharing information to help prevent bad things from happening.
I will add to that the security research space, things that used to take minutes for security researchers take days, take teams, take a longer time. We don't see, we do see that some systems are much more resilient than they used to be. So we're getting better at it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be sufficient to the threats because they have an infinite number of resources and an infinite amount of time, and we, on the defender side of things, have to defend everything all the time, 100%, which is impossible.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you all so much for coming and being on this panel. It's a really interesting topic for us. Hopefully it's interesting to you as well. And we appreciate everybody being here and appreciate you listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you.
Please welcome back to the stage Brad Stone, author and senior executive editor for technology at Bloomberg.
I want to thank all of my Bloomberg colleagues for moderating the panels today, all of our wonderful speakers who made the day so informative and interesting. I want to thank you guys for being such an engaged audience. And one more time for posterity, our sponsors today, Ericsson, IBM, MasterCard, Autonomous, and the Zurich Insurance Group. The bar is open. Please join me and my Bloomberg colleagues at the networking reception outside. Thank you.
Keep me dancing till I'm dead. 'Cause I could run a mile like this. Head over heels, feels like this. The sun has got me on my track. I ain't never looking back. I ain't looking back. I ain't looking back. I ain't looking. Ain't looking back. Deep inside the depths of stone, voice will echo me no phone. Ruled by the laws above, nature shows me, makes me taught. I could climb this mountain.